Chapter 55. There were 3 guides, but the group of 2 men and 1 woman clearly did not need so many. Hence, they borrowed a quiet room from the owner of the tavern and chatted with the 3 guides for a while. The dark, skinny old man went in for a while and came out. He squatted by the side and smoked his pipe. He did not say that he wanted to leave, nor did he look happy. It seemed like he was waiting for some result. The burly man went in and came out after a while. He sat down casually and asked the owner of the tavern for a pot of wine. He drank and looked like he was also waiting. Finally, the young man named Wuxia walked in. The room was not big, but it was really quiet. After closing the door, almost no sound could be heard from outside. There were 2 men and a woman in the room. The leader looked to be a middle-aged man in his 40s, and the 2 people beside him were the man who looked to be in his early 20s. He was quite handsome, and when he looked at Wuxia, there was a hint of arrogance in the depths of his eyes. The last person was a young girl who looked to be about 16 or 17 years old. She had fair skin, black eyebrows, and a jade-like nose. She was very beautiful, and she was looking at Wuxia curiously. She seemed a little surprised that someone so young could become a guide in such a dangerous place. Seeing Wuxia come in, the middle-aged man smiled at him and said, "Brother Lu, please take a seat." Wuxia smiled and nodded. He sat down on the empty stool in the room. The middle-aged man did not waste any time and asked directly, "We are going to the disorienting lands to find a spiritual material called the dusk mist flower. Has Brother Lu heard of it? Can you lead us to it?" Wuxia lowered his eyes and seemed to ponder for a moment. He then looked at the 3 people again and finally at the middle-aged man. He smiled and said, 200 spirit stones. What? Although the middle-aged man seemed to be quite restrained, his expression changed when he heard this number, revealing a look of astonishment. The 2 young men behind him were shocked at first, then angry. The young man was so angry that he stood up, pointed at Wuxia and said angrily, "How dare you? You bastard! Do you think we are stupid and want to extort money from us? Those 2 just now only asked us for 50 spirit stones at most." Little he. The one who shouted to stop was the middle-aged man. He seemed to be able to keep his composure, but his expression was also very ugly at this moment. He looked coldly at Wuxia and said, "What my martial nephew said just now is the truth. Brother, you opened your mouth with such a high price. Could it be that you are really here to make fun of us?" As he finished speaking, his brows furrowed, and there was a faint aura of might on his face. Wuxia didn't show any signs of fear because of the anger of these people in front of him. His expression was still calm. At the same time, he leaned forward a little, got closer to the middle-aged man, and said softly, "Do you want a 1-stripe or a 2-stripe one?" The middle-aged man raised his eyebrows and his expression changed. He seemed to have a whole new level of respect for the young man in front of him. At the same time, his eyes lit up and he said, You actually know about this 2-striped dusk mist flower?" Wuxia smiled and didn't say anything. He just nodded. There were countless spirit materials and treasures in the world, and they all had different effects and grades. In the cultivation world, the grade and value of a spirit material was usually determined by the number of spirit inscriptions it could condense and manifest. A spirit material with 1 spirit inscription was a 1-striped spirit material, and 2 spirit inscriptions was a 2-striped spirit material, and so on. The more spirit inscriptions a spirit material had, the higher its grade and value. In fact, a 2-striped spirit material with an extra spirit inscription was often worth dozens of times more than a 1-striped spirit material. In the vast central divine region, almost all spirit materials were strictly classified under this system. However, there was a strange and miraculous place in the world, and that was the land of confusion, where the 5 elements were inverted and chaotic. For some strange reason, among the countless spirit materials in the land of confusion, an extremely small portion of them would suddenly undergo a strange change, and the number of spirit inscriptions they contained would inexplicably increase. Of course, this kind of situation was extremely rare. Even if it wasn't seen in 100 years, it was something that ordinary people could only hope for. However, over the years, the cultivation world of the human race had discovered that these spirit materials that suddenly mutated in the land of confusion not only greatly increased their grade and spiritual power, but also contained some special effects. Not only were they greatly beneficial to the cultivation of immortality, but they could also sometimes produce unexpected surprises when refining immortal pills and spirit medicines. As a result, this kind of mutated spirit material had always been highly valued in the cultivation world, and its value had always been high. However, among the countless spirit materials in the land of confusion, only an extremely small portion of them could mutate. Due to various selfish reasons, no one had ever discovered this kind of spirit material. Famous sects and large sects would always keep it a secret, and lone cultivators would either consume it themselves or secretly sell it. Very few of them were willing to publicize their discovery. As a result, to this day, there were actually only a dozen or so spirit materials that could mutate. The other mutated spirit materials were only known by a small circle of people. The duskmist flower was one of the latter, a spirit material that was not well known and could mutate. Yes, I know, replied Lu Chen as if he was talking about something that couldn't be more ordinary. The three people sitting in front of him looked at each other with different expressions. The young and beautiful girl looked excited and surprised, while the man called Xiao He frowned. When he looked at Lu Chen, there was a hint of wariness in his eyes, as if he didn't completely trust him. The middle-aged man, who was the leader, pondered for a moment, then said to Lu Chen, "Brother Lu is very knowledgeable and admirable. To tell you the truth, it would be best if the three of yous could find a mutated two-striped duskmist flower. However, this kind of thing can only be found by luck. We can only ask a guide to bring us to the land of confusion to find where the duskmist flower grows, and then we can try our luck one by one. Brother Lu, although you are very knowledgeable, if you want to pay 4 or 5 times more than the other two just because of this, then we really can't. What if I promise to bring you to the two-striped duskmist flower?" asked Lu Chen. "What, you can really find it?" This time, it was the pretty girl who blurted out. Seeing the joy on her face, she couldn't help but stand up. Lu Chen smiled at her, then said to the middle-aged man, "In the market, a mutated spirit material is worth at least 1 grade higher than a spirit material. In other words, a 2-striped duskmist flower is equivalent to a 3-striped duskmist flower, and its rarity is much higher. So, 200 spirit stones isn't that high, is it?" The middle-aged man was silent, but Xiao He, who was behind him, snorted and said, "You're right, but how can you guarantee that you can find such a rare 2-striped duskmist flower?" Lu Chen shrugged and didn't argue with Xiao He. He only raised 2 fingers to the middle-aged man and said, 200 spirit stones. Right. Then, as if remembering something, he added, "I only care about bringing you to find this thing. As for how to pick it, store it, or if we encounter demonic beasts or poisonous creatures along the way, or if other cultivators try to rob us of it, I don't care." Chapter 56. After stating his conditions, Lu Chen left the room and waited in the tavern like the 2 people in front of him. After discussing behind closed doors for a while, the 3 of them walked out of the small house. The middle-aged man in the lead walked directly in front of Lu Chen and said, "Pay half first, and then pay the other half after we find the item." Lu Chen raised his head, smiled at him, and nodded. Coming out from the south gate of the Crescent City, they walked along the road that could barely be considered flat but was overgrown with weeds. They could see many pedestrians on the road, as well as the 2 mountain peaks in front of them that looked like screens. The road extended forward, and it seemed to lead to the foot of the mountain. Lu Chen and the 3 employers that had already been introduced to each other were walking on the road. The middle-aged man in the lead was called Han Nanzu, the young man was called He Gang, and the last beautiful woman was surnamed Yi, with a single name, Exit. However, their self-introductions were limited to this. They did not mention a single word about their background, and it was hard to say whether these names were real or fake. However, Lu Chen didn't mind this at all. In a place like the disorientated land where good and bad people mixed together and danger lurked in every corner, everyone had to be cautious. Moreover, Han Nanzu and the others didn't try to get to the bottom of Lu Chen's identity and origins. Perhaps they also knew that they wouldn't be able to learn much from Lu Chen. After walking for a while, Lu Chen pointed at the two mountains in front of them and smiled at the three people beside him. The two mountains in front of us, the one on the left is called Tiger Mountain, and the one on the right is called Dragon Mountain. There is a canyon between the two mountains, commonly known as One Line of Sky, and also known as Leaping Tiger Gorge. It is said that a long time ago, someone saw a fierce tiger jumping from this mountain to that mountain, hence the name. Could it be that there are really fierce tigers on this Tiger Mountain? The one who said this was Xian with a curious expression. Lu Chen smiled without saying a word, but Gang snorted and said, "Junior sister, these are just wild rumors, how can you take them seriously?" Xian's face turned red, and she made an "oh" sound, looking a little embarrassed. Lu Chen pretended that he didn't see anything as he smiled and said, "Once we pass through the Leaping Tiger Gorge, we will be considered to have entered the land of chaos. Although there won't be much danger in the beginning, the deeper we go, the more chaotic the five elemental spiritual energy will be. The various demonic beasts will also become more ferocious and powerful, so everyone should be careful." Han Nanzu nodded slightly, but before he could speak, Gang calmly said, "It's just the outer regions of the chaotic lands. If there are any dangers, we will naturally deal with them. Since your cultivation is low, don't drag the three of us down." "Senior brother," Xian called out to Gang, as if she felt that his words were a little unpleasant. Han Nanzu, who was walking in front, also frowned slightly. Lu Chen didn't seem to be angry, but instead smiled and said, "Brother, he is right. In terms of cultivation, I can't compare to the three of you. I barely have the ability to protect my life. If I encounter any danger in the future, I will try my best to hide and not cause trouble for the three of you. However, if we encounter any danger that is difficult to deal with, we can only ask for Brother He's help when the time comes." Hearing Lu Chen's humble words, Gang's expression immediately eased up and he said with a slightly proud expression, "Of course, we still need to rely on you to find the two-striped dusk fog flower." Lu Chen laughed and cupped his hands, "Then I will thank Brother He in advance." Gang smiled and didn't reply, only walking forward with his hands clasped behind his back. At the side, Han Nanzu saw this scene and frowned. He seemed to want to say something, but in the end, he shook his head and remained silent. The four of them walked for about half an hour and finally arrived in front of the Leaping Tiger Gorge that Lu Chen had mentioned. Standing at the foot of the Green Mountain, they suddenly felt that the surrounding trees were dense and the temperature seemed to have dropped significantly. A gorge passed through two mountains with only one winding mountain path winding around the gorge. The widest part of the path seemed to be only 6 or 7 feet wide. At this moment, the Leaping Tiger Gorge wasn't empty. Although it wasn't as lively as the Crescent City, there were still some people coming and going. From their appearance and clothing, they seemed to be cultivators. However, apart from those who were traveling with them, when they passed by or approached someone else, those cultivators' eyes would reveal a very obvious vigilance. Needless to say, the cultivators walking in the Leaping Tiger Gorge were those who planned to explore the disorienting lands, or those who had already explored and returned. Under Lu Chen's lead, Han Nanzu and the others also entered the Leaping Tiger Gorge. Once they entered the gorge, they saw that the surrounding scenery had changed once again. On both sides of the gorge, there were towering rocks, old trees, and ancient vines everywhere. From time to time, there would be grotesquely shaped rocks jutting out of the gorge. In addition to the occasional appearance of a mountain spring, the mossy water converged to form a stream, giving the place a sense of a different scenery with each step. As for Xian, it seemed like this was the first time she had come to the disorienting lands. She looked at the scenery in front of her with admiration, occasionally exclaiming in surprise when she saw one or two unique sceneries. She seemed to still have a childlike innocence, making the journey a bit more lively. The Leaping Tiger Gorge was rugged and narrow, but the entire journey was uneventful. An hour later, they arrived at the entrance of the gorge. At the end of the path was a large stone with the word, "Disorienting Lands," engraved on it. The four of them stopped next to the large stone. Han Nanzu and the others looked at each other with solemn expressions. Once they passed through the stone, they would officially enter the disorienting lands. For many years, this place had always been known for its dangers. Since ancient times, it had devoured the lives of countless cultivators. It could be said to be an ominous place. In comparison, Lu Chen appeared calm and relaxed. He walked over to the stone and lightly patted it. Then he smiled at Han Nanzu and the others before walking past the stone. Han Nanzu and the others quickly followed. As soon as they walked out of the Leaping Tiger Gorge, Han Nanzu and the others suddenly felt a strange and inexplicable feeling sweep past their bodies. It was like an invisible breeze, causing the spiritual energy in their Dantian's Qi to tremble for no reason. But after carefully sensing it, they discovered that there wasn't much of a difference. Lu Chen said, "We have only just entered the disorienting lands, so the 5 elements of chaos are not obvious. At the very least, within 1,000 miles of the disorienting lands, there is no effect on the cultivation of human cultivators. There is no need to panic." Han Nanzu nodded with a calm expression. It seemed that he had some experience in the disorienting lands. He said, "Many thanks for Brother Lu's reminder. What do we plan to do next?" Lu Chen said, "The dusk mist flower that you are looking for can be found in the Black Armor Mountain about 150 miles to the southwest. However, the road is difficult to traverse and there should be some obstacles along the way. It will take about a day or 2 to get there." Han Nanzu nodded. "Since that is the case, then we should hurry." Lu Chen agreed with a smile and led the way forward. At the same time, he raised his head to look at the sky. In this late autumn season, the sky was clear and blue. The world was tranquil and there were even a few white clouds slowly drifting by. High up in the sky, far away from the sight of these 4 people, a layer of white clouds floated like silk. A few rays of sword light suddenly shot out from the layer of clouds, streaked across the horizon, and flew towards the depths of the Land of Chaos. Chapter 57. The Land of Chaos was extremely vast, spanning over 1,000,000 miles. It was filled with countless dangers and countless lives had been lost there since ancient times. However, the lessons learned through blood and tears were not without value. Today, the cultivation world of the divine central continent had a general understanding of this vast and mysterious and chaotic land. Roughly speaking, the Land of Chaos could be divided into 3 parts. From the northernmost boundary to the south, it extended for hundreds of thousands of miles to the great river, Dragon River. This was the outer boundary of the Land of Chaos. Beyond the Dragon River, one would continue for hundreds of thousands of miles to the south until they reached the unreachable Great Snowy Mountain. This was the central part of the Land of Chaos. Further south was the core of the Land of Chaos, but it was also the most dangerous region. Countless dangerous places and terrifying creatures resided in this place known as the Abyss of Chaos, including the spirit-shattering sand sea that human cultivators feared. Generally speaking, the deeper one ventured into the Land of Chaos, the more chaotic the 5 elements would be, and the more dangerous the various dangers would be. Even though there was no publicly acknowledged boundary, there was a kind of secret consensus in the cultivation world of the Central Plains. That was, most of the cultivators who came to the Land of Chaos were only active in the outer boundary of the Land of Chaos. As for the wider central region, the degree of danger there was such that only cultivators at the Jin Dan stage or above were qualified to go there. As for the core of the Land of Chaos, the Abyss of Chaos was so dangerous that it was said that even spiritual master Yuanying did not dare to set foot there. It could be said to be the most dangerous place in the world. The Black Armor Mountain that Lu Chen was leading Han Nanzu and the others to was only near the border of the Land of Chaos. It was only a few hundred miles deep into the Land of Chaos. In a place like this, the spiritual energy of the 5 elements in the Land of Chaos was not very chaotic. For most human cultivators who came here, they would at most feel a slight obstruction in the circulation of their spiritual energy. Apart from that, they were almost negligible. Along the way, Lu Chen and Han Nanzu were fine, but He Gang and Exen were on high alert. They kept a close eye on their surroundings, afraid that some ferocious and powerful demon beast would jump out of the bushes and bushes beside them if they were not careful. However, as the sky darkened, they had covered about half the distance. In the end, apart from a wandering lynx demon beast, they encountered no other dangers. Even that lynx, which did not seem to be a powerful demon beast, was cut in half by He Gang's sword. In the evening, Lu Chen brought them to the foot of a mountain. After turning left and right, they found a large boulder and circled around it. To their surprise, a dry cave was revealed. He turned around and smiled at Han Nanzu and the others, saying, "Let's sleep here tonight." After entering the cave to tidy up and settle down, Xianxia, who had been on high alert for the entire day, felt as though she had used all her strength to strike empty air. She couldn't help but ask Han Nanzu, "Senior Uncle Han, didn't they say that the disorienting lands is filled with demonic beasts, poisonous creatures, and all kinds of unimaginable dangers? Why haven't we encountered anything on our way here? I don't think it's any different from outside the disorienting lands." Han Nanzu glared at her and snappily said, "You've never seen the world, don't talk nonsense." After saying that, he turned to look at Lu Chen and said seriously, "I didn't expect Brother Lu to be so familiar with the terrain of this area. If it's still the same tomorrow, let alone finding the dusk mist flower, just the fact that you've brought us along this part of the road is worth the price." Lu Chen smiled and said, "You flatter me." At this moment, He Gang, who was sitting to the side, showed a trace of dissatisfaction on his face. He seemed to want to say something, but in the end, he didn't say anything. Lu Chen saw He Gang's expression from the corner of his eye, but he didn't take it to heart. He only smiled and said, "In the disorienting lands, it has always been more dangerous at night. Even this area near the edge of the disorienting lands is much more dangerous at night than during the day. However, this place is very safe and there aren't any powerful demonic beasts nearby. After resting here for the night, we'll continue our journey tomorrow." Han Nanzu nodded and said, "I'll listen to you." In the blink of an eye, it was already late at night. Darkness pervaded the outside, but this night, there was a bright moon hanging high in the sky. The cold moonlight spilled over the mountains and fields. The night wind blew gently, rustling the branches of the trees. There was also the sound of insects chirping. No one knew where it came from, but it was intermittent. In the cave, the two youths were already asleep. Lu Chen leaned against the wall, his gaze falling on Han Nanzu. He saw that Han Nanzu's eyes were closed, but both his hands were placed on the sheath of his sword. It seemed that if there was even the slightest sound, he would immediately wake up and draw his sword to meet the enemy. Lu Chen glanced at the sheathed sword and then closed his eyes as well. At this moment, the chirping of the insects outside the cave suddenly quieted down. A gust of cold night wind blew past, bringing with it a slight chill. Lu Chen slowly opened his eyes. In order to avoid attracting demonic beasts, there was no fire in the cave, so most of the place was dark. However, in the shadows, Lu Chen's eyes seemed especially bright. The wind outside the cave was faintly blowing, and there seemed to be some strange noises coming from the depths of the forest in the distance. However, it could not be heard clearly, or perhaps it was just an illusion of the dead of night. However, Lu Chen quietly stood up and the shadows around him flowed like water. Almost in an instant, they blended into one with him, and even his shadow disappeared, becoming a part of the darkness. He followed the shadows and walked out of the cave without a sound. In the cave, Han Nanzu was still sleeping with his eyes closed. He Gang and Xianxia were completely unaware. The moonlight was cold, and after being blocked by the nearby trees, a beam of light fell on the side of the cave. Lu Chen stood at the entrance of the cave for a moment. His gaze was calm as he slowly looked around. Finally, his gaze fell on the southwest direction. There was a forest over there. In the darkness of the night, the trees were like tall guards and the thick shadows were like cold and gloomy ghosts, appearing somewhat gloomy and terrifying. Lu Chen did not hesitate too much and directly walked into the forest. The darkness wrapped around him, as if he had instantly blended into the gloomy forest. It was as if he was born to belong to the darkness, and the shadows were innate. The forest was silent, but as he gradually went deeper, the darkness fluctuated and suddenly there was a roar. The surrounding darkness suddenly trembled violently and a huge figure instantly rushed out from the darkness, letting out an earth-shattering roar. The roar tore apart the silence of the entire forest. It was as if all the darkness had suddenly tightened in an instant and a fierce wind suddenly rushed over. In the darkness, the dense stench of fangs emitted a palpitating light. In the blink of an eye, it was already in front of him and a huge sharp claw slashed down. Roar! That was a bloodthirsty roar. In the midst of the crazy roar, Lu Chen did not dodge. Only his eyes slightly narrowed. Ding! Suddenly, a crisp sound suddenly sounded. Although soft, it was loud and clear, instantly suppressing all the roars and roars. A sword light rushed out from the depths of the darkness. In the blink of an eye, the light was dazzling, like the bright moon in the night sky had fallen into the human world, blooming with a dazzling brilliance that could not be looked at directly. The sword light was like water, its momentum like a flood, piercing the darkness and cutting open the shadows. The huge figure roared and turned back, but suddenly became silent. Then, the darkness was split into two halves by this sword light. The smell of blood instantly filled the air. In the darkness, there was a rain of blood. Everything seemed to have stopped in an instant. Only that stunning and cold sword light was still moving forward in the darkness, piercing through the shadows. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived in front of Lu Chen. It was unstoppable and did not seem to stop. Chapter 58. Lu Chen took a step back, looking as if he had been frightened. His face was tense, and he had one hand in front of his chest while the other hung by his side. Then he quietly reached behind him in the shadows, as if he had grabbed something in the dark. At that moment, the sword light was like a bright moon, its splendor illuminating the entire forest. The wind howled like a surging torrent, but in the next moment, the sword blade in the light suddenly stopped inches in front of Lu Chen. The sword light that filled the sky sprinkled down like a shower of stars, gradually converging, and finally quietly converging into the long sword that was as bright as autumn water. Darkness swarmed over, drowning the figure opposite him in the same shadow. It was vaguely a woman. Her face could not be seen clearly. The only light in the dark forest was the sword in her hand. The wind rose again in the forest, faintly blowing past. The pattering from the sky was dark red blood. A drop of blood landed on the tip of the sword, gently trembling, with a soul-stirring and strange beauty. Lu Chen felt a chill between his brows, as if an invisible sword had already stabbed down in that instant. That sword stopped in front of him, silently in the darkness. "Why didn't you dodge?" A calm but pleasant female voice came from the shadows in front of them. Lu Chen took a deep breath, said, "Your skills are too high, the sword force is too fast, I can't dodge." The woman in the darkness snorted, said, "Since it is so, why are you secretly holding a weapon behind your back? What is your intention?" Lu Chen immediately raised his right hand that was hanging by his side. Without any hesitation, he threw out the black short sword that he was holding in his hand. After a while, there was a muffled "piu" sound. The black sword was stabbed into a nearby tree trunk. Lu Chen spread out his hands, indicating that he was unarmed, and then slowly put them down. That bright long sword still stopped in front of him, did not waver in the slightest, and also did not have any intention of withdrawing. The night wind blew, that drop of blood on the sword tip trembled and twisted a few times, suddenly split into two, quietly drifting from the two sides of the blade to the dark ground. In that instant, the long sword's light seemed to brighten a little. The sharp sword tip also seemed to slightly raise its head. The surroundings were silent. In the depths of Lu Chen's eyes, his pupils also slightly contracted. But that instant passed in the blink of an eye. The long sword suddenly retreated, silently submerged into the darkness, returned to the woman's side, and then disappeared. There was a bit of light in the shadows, as if it was her bright and clear eyes. She glanced at Lu Chen without saying anything, turned and left, disappearing into the darkness in the blink of an eye. And at the moment when she turned, the darkness surged. Suddenly there seemed to be a faint red light flickering in the shadows. Lu Chen saw that moment of light, although it was a bit blurry, but he still saw that the woman's shoulder was draped with a scarlet feather shawl. Like the wings of a bird, it spread out behind her in the night, soaring in the night, floating into the distance. Lu Chen stood in place for a while, his eyebrows gradually wrinkled, as if thinking about something. After a while, he walked to the side of the tree trunk and took back the black short sword. It was unknown what movement his hand made, but after a slight tremble in the darkness, the the black sword disappeared. Then, Lu Chen took a few steps forward, and then half-squatted down. The surrounding smell of blood began to diffuse, and blood dyed the ground in the forest red. Not far away, a terrible demon beast's body was split into two and fell to the ground. "Black demon bear," Lu Chen said in a low voice, then walked over and fiddled with the remains of the demon beast with his feet. "The demon core is gone, it should have been taken away by her. That sword was so powerful, it should be moonlight chop?" He was silent for a moment, then stood up, looked into the depths of the darkness in the distance, and said to himself in a low voice, "When did the Kunlun party have such a powerful young genius? But about that shawl?" Lu Chen paused, shook his head, and said nothing, then turned around and walked back the way he came. Just for a moment, the darkness followed him like a shadow, and in the blink of an eye, he also disappeared into the shadows. The next morning, after Han Nanzu and the others woke up, the group of 4 continued on their journey to the Black Armor Mountain. Perhaps it was because they were gradually entering the depths of the disorienting lands, they encountered more demon beasts today than yesterday. But under Lu Chen's lead, they still avoided most of the dangers along the way, and after half a day, they finally saw the peak of the Black Armor Mountain. Because it was almost impossible for ordinary people to enter the disorienting lands, most of the people who came here were human cultivators. Therefore, there were many places in the wilderness where there were no people, and of course, there were no roads. But there were exceptions to everything. For example, some popular places, human cultivators would come here many times, and some roads would appear after they stepped on it. For example, Lu Chen's group of 4 was currently standing on a small hill, and there was a 3-way fork in the road. Lu Chen pointed in the southwest direction, and said to Han Nanzu and the others, "If we go in this direction, we will reach the Black Armor Mountain in an hour at most." Han Nanzu nodded, and looked at the seemingly inconspicuous mountain in the distance. A trace of a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Standing to the side, Exen looked around curiously, and finally her gaze fell on the road under her feet, and she asked Lu Chen, "Brother Lu, did you say that this road was formed by many people?" Lu Chen said, "Yes." Exen said, "Could it be that everyone is going to the Black Armor Mountain? Doesn't that mean that all the spiritual materials on the mountain have been collected by people?" Lu Chen said with a smile, "That's not it. Although there are evening fog flowers and some other spiritual materials on the Black Armor Mountain, they are almost the lowest grade of 1-mark spiritual materials, so they can't attract too many people. The cultivators who often walk here go to another place." "Another place?" Exion's gaze drifted to another intersection, where the road meandered forward, leading to the southeast. "What is that over there? Is there any good place to go?" Lu Chen thought for a moment, and said, "Hundreds of miles south from here, there are quite a few famous spiritual material production areas, such as Green Sunflower Cave, 5 Peaks Mountain, Yellow Mud Pond. Usually, many cultivators go there." "I see." Exin nodded, and said with a smile, "Brother Lu, you are really knowledgeable." Lu Chen shrugged and said with a smile, "Don't forget that this is what I do for a living." Exin smiled sweetly, but Gang looked a little unconvinced, and snorted, "In my opinion, although there are several places here, the most famous ones are clearly not those." Exin was stunned for a moment, and said, "Senior brother, what do you know?" Gang said with an arrogant face, "Before coming here, I have done my homework. 800 miles south from here is the battlefield of the righteous and demonic path 10 years ago, which is also the location of the famous Barren Valley. That is the place that countless cultivators want to go to the most. Brother Lu, am I right?" Gang squinted at Lu Chen. Lu Chen was silent for a moment, and then said with a calm face, "Yes." Chapter 59. Exion's eyes lit up and her face revealed a pleasantly surprised expression. She said, "So the desolate valley is over there? I heard that 10 years ago, the evil cult set up some kind of sinister formation there in an attempt to absorb the blood, flesh and soul of thousands of living beings. As a result, our Xianxia sent an army to break through the formation, causing the evil cult to suffer a great loss of vitality. Until now, they have not been able to recover." Lu Chen was startled. He looked at Xianxia with a trace of astonishment on his face. He said, "Set up a formation to absorb the blood and essence of living beings? Where did you hear this?" Xianxia was about to answer, but Gang sneered and said, "Junior sister, don't listen to hearsay. In that battle, it was clearly the evil cult's evil people who secretly gathered in the desolate valley and set up the 18 Hell Prison formation. They intended to summon the Yellow Springs evil spirit army to harm the human world. It has nothing to do with living beings or blood." Xianxia frowned and showed an unconvinced expression. She said, "No. I clearly heard Master talking about this. He said so." As she said this, she turned her head to look at Lu Chen and said, "Brother Lu, what do you think? Have you ever heard of what the evil cult did in the desolate valley before?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment. He revealed a bitter smile and shook his head. "I also don't know." Gang wanted to say something, but he saw Han Nanzu, who was walking in front, glared at the two of them and said, "What are you talking about? Let's go quickly." Gang and Xianxia seemed to have a lot of respect for this martial uncle. Hearing this, they did not dare to say anything more. The group of 4 continued to walk towards the Black Armor Mountain in the southwest. As for the fork leading to another direction, no one passed by. It was as quiet as before among the weeds. When they walked to the foot of the Black Armor Mountain and began to climb the mountain, the ease of the journey disappeared. Because on the Black Armor Mountain, there were almost demon beasts everywhere. Even with a guide like Lu Chen, it was difficult to find a shortcut. The demonic beasts in the chaotic lands were ferocious creatures. When they saw people passing by, they would often attack. Therefore, Han Nanzu and the others took out their weapons and killed the demonic beasts along the way. Fortunately, this place was not too deep into the disorienting lands. The strength of the demonic beasts on the mountain was only average. They were ferocious but not intelligent. Han Nanzu and the others were able to deal with them. However, halfway up the mountain, Gang, who had a few drops of blood on his face and body, could no longer endure it. He looked coldly at Lu Chen and said coldly, "Lu Chen, why aren't you attacking?" Along the way, Lu Chen had indeed been watching with folded arms. Strangely, most of the demonic beasts on the mountain were looking for Han Nanzu and the others. Very few of them went to cause trouble for Lu Chen. Lu Chen was also happy to be at ease. He had been watching the battle from the side and had no intention of helping at all. After hearing Gang's words, Lu Chen grinned and said, "We have an agreement. I only need to lead the way. I don't care about anything else." Gang was furious, but he was immediately stopped by Han Nanzu. This middle-aged man looked at Lu Chen and frowned. "Brother Lu, since we have promised you, we will not go back on our words. However, now that we have reached the Black Armor Mountain, where is the Dusk Fog Flower?" Lu Chen smiled and took 2 steps forward. Looking at the mountain, he waved his hand and said, "Follow me." The group of 4 continued to move forward. Han Nanzu and the others followed behind Lu Chen. They saw that he was walking towards the east of the Black Armor Mountain. In less than an hour, they encountered several groups of demonic beasts. The others were fine, but when they walked to the side of a mountain stream, they encountered a group of black jackals, which was a bit troublesome. Black jackals were ordinary low-level demonic beasts. They looked similar to the dogs of the farmers in the mountains outside the chaotic lands, except that they were a bit bigger and more ferocious. Individually, even on the Black Armor Mountain, black jackals were a relatively weak kind of demonic beasts. However, this kind of demonic beasts were born to be in groups. Almost no black jackals appeared alone. At the same time, this kind of demonic beasts was relatively smarter than other demonic beasts. When they encountered prey, they would swarm together, which was not easy to deal with. On the mountain road beside the mountain stream, Lu Chen and the others encountered such a group of black jackals. There were about 7 or 8 of them. In fact, it was not a big group, but even so, these black jackals showed Gang and Xianxia what was called cunning. The group of demonic beasts surrounded them from all sides. They even used the strategy of making a sound in the east and attacking in the west. Then they quickly judged that Xianxia and Gang were the 2 weakest among them. Suddenly, they attacked together, catching the 2 young people off guard. Especially Xianxia, because she had not been in the Jianghu, When she saw the ferocious and abnormal demonic beasts pouncing on her, she turned pale and could only use 50% of her power. Fortunately, there was Han Nanzu, who had profound cultivation and rich experience on this side. He rushed forward with a sword, killed 3 demonic beasts and wounded 2. Only then did the rest of the demonic beasts retreat and saved Xianxia, who was a little embarrassed. During this process, Lu Chen still did not make a move. Xianxia was still in a state of shock, so it was fine, but Gang was glaring angrily. Just as he was about to let loose a torrent of abuse, he suddenly saw Lu Chen standing on the stone cliff beside the mountain stream, looking down, then beckoning to them. "We're here, the dusk fog flower is right below." Lu Chen's words weren't wrong. When Han Nanzu and the others came over to take a look, they discovered that there was indeed a waterfall that was several meters tall at the bottom of the mountain stream. The water flowed down and converged into a pool, and there were many pink flowers growing on the wet stone walls beside it. This time, Gang couldn't be bothered to argue with Lu Chen anymore. They hurriedly found a path to descend the mountain and walked all the way to the pool. Han Nanzu looked at the stone wall and smiled. "It really is the dusk fog flower. I didn't think there would be so many here." Gang and Xianxia were also very happy. Their goal this time was actually to pick 10 dusk fog flowers and return to complete the task. But looking at the flowers on the stone wall, there were at least 20 of them. It was obviously a big harvest. Immediately, Gang and Xianxia rushed to the stone wall to pick, while Han Nanzu walked to Lu Chen's side and said, "Brother Lu, this place is really good, thank you. But the 2-striped dusk fog flower you mentioned before?" Lu Chen nodded and pointed to the waterfall, saying, "If I'm not wrong, on the stone wall behind the curtain of water, there should be a 2-striped dusk fog flower. You should go and take a look." Han Nanzu was startled, and a trace of surprise appeared in his eyes. But after thinking for a moment, he still nodded and walked towards the waterfall. When he came to the side of the waterfall, he quickly climbed up the stone wall. Although many places looked slippery, it did not seem to be a problem for him. Not long after, his figure suddenly stopped, and then he looked into the water, plucked a large red flower from behind the water, and then jumped down. After landing on the ground, Han Nanzu carefully looked at the red flower in his hand, and suddenly a smile appeared on his face. He nodded and said with a smile, "It really is a 2-striped dusk fog flower." After thinking for a moment, he directly took out a small bag from his bosom and threw it to Lu Chen. "Your remaining half of the reward." Lu Chen caught it and nodded with a smile. Just as he was about to say something, he suddenly frowned and looked back. The wilderness was quiet. Other than the sound of the mountain breeze blowing through the treetops, there was almost no other movement. Just that right now, there was something strange. In the wind, there seemed to be 1 or 2 light long howls and barks coming from afar. Lu Chen's face darkened, and he turned around with a frown. He said to Han Nanzu, "Stop picking, let's leave this place." Chapter 60. Why is that? Han Nanzu was startled and asked doubtfully. Lu Chen did not answer him immediately. Instead, he raised his head and called out to Gang and Xianxia, who were climbing the stone wall not far away, "You two, come down first." Gang and Xianxia looked back and were also a little surprised, but they quickly followed the stone wall down. Walking to Lu Chen, Xianxia rushed to ask, "Brother Lu, we are picking dusk fog flowers. Why did you call us down?" Lu Chen said, "Don't pick them first, we'd better leave this place immediately." Gang and Xianxia were both taken aback, their faces revealing a stunned expression. Han Nanzu frowned as he gazed at Lu Chen and said, "Brother Lu, what exactly has happened?" Lu Chen said, "I feel that there is something wrong with the surroundings. There may be more black jackals coming." Gang immediately sneered and said disapprovingly, "It's just a kind of inferior demon beast. What's there to be afraid of?" Lu Chen raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at Gang with a meaningful look. When Gang was looked at by him, he suddenly recalled that when he encountered the group of black jackals earlier, his performance was a little embarrassing. For a moment, he felt a little embarrassed and said angrily, "What are you looking at?" "When we encountered the group of black jackals earlier, we were only unprepared. Once we faced them head-on, who would be afraid of those beasts? I can easily defeat them." "Enough." A light shout rang out. It was Han Nanzu who stopped Gang in time. However, at the same time, there was a trace of displeasure on his face as he said, "Brother Lu, these dusk mist flowers are very important to us. Moreover, we've also fought against those black jackals earlier. I believe you've seen for yourself that there's no problem." Lu Chen sighed and said, "In this mountain forest, black jackals are in groups, and the number of dogs varies. There are only a few dogs in a small group, and there may be hundreds of dogs in a large group. If a large group of wild dogs were to come and gang up on you, it would be quite dangerous." Han Nanzu was silent, and there was some hesitation between his eyebrows. But Yexen looked back at the stone wall beside the waterfall and said, "Martial uncle, we have only picked a few dusk fog flowers, there are still many more up there." Han Nanzu looked back and found that there were indeed more than half of the dusk fog flowers on the stone wall that had not been picked. At this moment, they were slightly trembling in the moist wind, looking particularly beautiful. He hesitated for a moment, thinking in his mind about the use of the dusk fog flowers after bringing them back, and then he said decisively, "Continue picking. Quickly. Once we have picked all these dusk flowers, we will leaving immediately." But Gang and Xian agreed at the same time. As soon as he finished speaking, Xian immediately turned around and left. Gang glared at Lu Chen with a bit of disdain, then turned around and strode towards the stone wall. Lu Chen looked at his back and shook his head slightly, then said to Han Nanzu, "In that case, I have promised the three of you to find this dusk fog flower, including the two-striped dusk fog flower. Now that I have done it, there is no need for me to stay here any longer. I will take my leave first." After saying this, he reached out to Han Nanzu and cupped his hands, then turned around and left. Han Nanzu looked at his back and wanted to say something, but then hesitated. After taking a deep breath, he turned around and walked towards the stone wall, ready to help Gang and Yexin. Lu Chen strode away from the mountain stream, walked to the edge of the stone cliff, found a high ground to jump on, and looked around. He saw that the Black Armor Mountain was densely forested, and there was a murderous atmosphere. Further away, in the forest, there were vague black shadows leaping up and down. He didn't know how many there were in the weeds, but he could vaguely see that the black shadows were moving in his direction, and their speed was not slow. Lu Chen's face slightly changed. He looked at the mountain stream under his feet, snorted softly, then turned around and strode away. After walking swiftly for over 300 m, Lu Chen suddenly heard a wave of enraged roars and curses resounding from afar in the forest behind him. But because it was far away, those voices couldn't be heard clearly. However, there were many miserable barks of wild dogs mixed within, and it was extremely clear. At the same time, strange whooshing sounds also sounded from the forest behind him. It seemed that some of the black shadows were also chasing him. Lu Chen's face darkened, and he cursed in a low voice, "The dog's nose is so sensitive." Standing in the same place and pondering for a moment, Lu Chen looked at the surrounding forest again, and then suddenly jumped on a tall tree. His movements were as nimble as a monkey's, and he climbed up the tree in no time. Then, when he reached a tree branch that was several feet above the ground, he suddenly used all his strength and jumped from one tree to another. He repeated this action more than a dozen times in a row. In this forest, he was like a nimble monkey. Unbeknownst to anyone, he leaped from branch to branch, leaped over 100 feet in the air, and then climbed to the densest branch, at least 100 feet above the ground, and quietly hid there. Not long after, he suddenly heard a sharp bark, and a large group of black shadows suddenly appeared in the forest. It was a large pack of dozens of black jackals. These ferocious wild dogs roared, as if they wanted to tear apart all the creatures in front of them. But when they chased all the way to the place where Lu Chen had climbed the tree, all the wild dogs seemed to have lost their target. They circled around in place, at a loss for what to do. The barking of the dogs was still sharp and ear-piercing, and the anger and ferocity in it chilled one's heart. But even though all the dogs were desperately sniffing in the nearby forest, and even expanding their range to more than a dozen feet away, they still found nothing. Lu Chen, who was hiding in the tree, held his breath and looked down through the gaps in the leaves. He saw a few black jackals had even run to the tree he was hiding in and searched, but they still couldn't smell anything. They looked very irritated and annoyed. Lu Chen looked coldly at the wild dogs on the ground below and did not move. Demonic beasts like black jackals were born with a fierce temperament and were the most vengeful. If these beasts found him on this tree, even if they could not climb trees, they would surround this tree and this forest. They would not stop until their prey was killed. In his memory, a long time ago, when he was still young, he had wandered around the Black Armor Mountain for a period of time. He once saw a large group of black jackals surround a bear on a tree for 7 days and 7 nights. In the end, the bear couldn't hold on any longer and was divided up by the black jackals. Lu Chen shook his head slightly and shook off the bad memories in his mind. Then he leaned against the tree trunk and prepared to wait for the sky to turn dark. Below, for some reason, the black jackals seemed unwilling to give up. Just like that, they searched back and forth in the forest. Even further away, the shouts and shouts of shock and anger, as well as the sounds of swords clashing and killing, gradually grew louder. Lu Chen glanced in the direction of the mountain stream. After a moment, he lowered his eyes expressionlessly. After an unknown period of time, the sounds of fighting gradually quieted down. Only the screams of the black jackals became more and more mournful. A gust of wind blew gently, and the leaves on the branches of the trees began to shake. It was a little cold. Lu Chen slowly opened his eyes and felt that it was dark in front of him. At this time, it was already dark. Chapter 61. The familiar night fell on this mountain, the darkness spreading like a tide. Only the moonlight on the horizon shone down a little. The black jackals below had disappeared, perhaps because they could not find any prey. They had no choice but to retreat. At this time, the forest was quiet. Only 1 or 2 low cries of insects could be heard from some unknown weeds. Lu Chen glanced in the direction of the mountain stream. At this time, it had long since quieted down, and there was no longer any movement. Lu Chen was expressionless. His face hidden among the branches and leaves looked exceptionally cold, completely different from his usual gentle expression in front of others. In the dim light, his eyes looked especially bright, like a silent beast hiding in the night. The forest under the night was quiet and cold. After a while, suddenly a figure rushed out of the darkness, staggering and running desperately, not caring even if the thorns in the forest hung on her clothes. Then, in the distance behind the figure, a few barks suddenly sounded, as if the appearance of the black figure had alarmed something, and then there was a terrible noisy roar, surging over here again. The black figure heard the shrill cries behind her, her body trembled, ran faster and faster, all the way to the tree where Lu Chen was. As she got closer, Lu Chen looked down from the tree and suddenly frowned. The person was slender and pretty, but her face was full of fear. It was Xianxia. This young girl's face was full of panic and even a little despair, as if she was running forward desperately out of the desire to survive. No one knew how she survived alone in the mountain stream during the day. Lu Chen frowned, turned his head to look at the darkness in the distance, listening carefully to the distance where the barks came from. After a moment of hesitation, he stretched out his palm and pressed the tree trunk, quietly sliding down from the tree. As soon as his feet landed on the ground, the feeling was completely different from when he was on the tree. Behind him was a deep darkness, but in the deep shadows, it seemed that a large group of terrible monsters would rush out at any time and tear him to pieces. Without hesitation, Lu Chen turned and ran forward. In this forest, his figure was fast and abnormally agile, looking like a monster, far better than Xianxia, who was running desperately in front of him. In just a few leaps and bounds, he had caught up to the fleeing woman. Lu Chen grabbed Xianxia's arm from behind. Xianxia's entire body shook violently, and she suddenly let out a shrill cry. Her voice sounded as if her heart was being torn apart, and with despair and a bit of madness on the verge of death, she turned around and slashed with her sword. The sound of the sword cutting through the air was sharp. It could be seen that Xianxia used all her strength. Lu Chen dodged to the side, avoiding the sword, at the same time said in a low voice, "It's me, Lu Chen." Xianxia's sword slashed empty air, her body was brought forward 2 steps, and just as she was about to fight again, she suddenly heard this sentence, her body suddenly trembled, her eyes revealed a look of disbelief, looked at Lu Chen, and then her lips flattened, as if she was about to cry, said, "Brother Lu, my martial uncle and senior brother, Lu Chen directly interrupted her crying, grabbed Xianxia's hand, and ran forward. At the same time he hurriedly said, "Don't talk nonsense. Let's run for our lives first." Xian was pulled by him, and she couldn't help but follow him. But after running for a while, Xian suddenly realized that something was wrong. Lu Chen didn't bring her along the mountain path they came from. Instead, he rushed directly into the dense forest in another direction. There were thorns and weeds everywhere, there was no path at all, and it was extremely difficult to run. After running for a short distance, Xian felt that not only were her clothes torn a few times, but there were also 4 or 5 wounds on her body. "Are we going the wrong way?" Xian shouted in panic. Lu Chen did not look back, just pulled her forward, and said at the same time, "Yes, the wild dogs will be here in the blink of an eye. Running along the original path is courting death." Xian's mind was in a mess, but she could feel Lu Chen's hand holding her steady and strong, making her subconsciously run with Lu Chen. And in this short time, in the darkness behind them, the terrible barking of the wild dogs had become much clearer. Obviously, the black jackals were rushing over here. The two of them fled through the thistles and thorns that were almost impenetrable. In just a short while, Xian felt as if she was being sliced apart by 1,000 cuts. Her entire body was pierced, torn, and even bleeding by the sharp thorns. Just when she was at a loss of what to do, all of a sudden, her feet slipped. In front of the two of them, there was suddenly a downhill slope, and the slope was very steep. Xian let out a scream, but before she could react, Lu Chen had already grabbed her wrist and dragged her down the hill. They instantly became 2 rolling gourds rolling down the hill. In the darkness, the roar of the wild dogs broke through the air and reached the hillside in the blink of an eye. There was a fishy smell in the air, but Xian didn't have time to think about it. She had completely lost control of her body and kept rolling around. She didn't know how many rocks and hardwood she hit in the middle, but she was covered in cuts and bruises. She only felt that the whole world was spinning, and strange stars kept flashing in front of her eyes. Her body seemed to no longer belong to her and was about to fall apart. There was only a blank space in her mind. The only remaining thought was probably, "Am I really going to die in this wilderness?" She didn't know when, but the rolling speed suddenly slowed down. After rolling for a distance, it finally stopped. Xian was in a daze for a while. She stood up, but her body suddenly tilted and fell to the side. After trying several times, she barely managed to maintain her balance and stood on the same spot. She gasped for breath and looked around. She saw that she was at the bottom of the hill. The surroundings were overgrown with weeds, but there were no tall trees. Moreover, there was the sound of water coming from somewhere nearby. Woof woof, roar, a wave of mournful barking came again. Xian's body trembled and she looked back. In the dark night, with the help of the weak moonlight, she could see black shadows jumping on the hillside. It was the ferocious black jackals chasing after them like maggots. A hand reached out from the shadows again. Lu Chen appeared beside her and grabbed Xian's arm, running forward with large strides. "Hold your breath," he shouted loudly. Xian was stunned and said, "What?" Before she finished speaking, she suddenly felt her body become light. It was Lu Chen who had jumped out with her. When they flew over the grass in front of them, the entire terrain suddenly opened up. There was no land under their feet, but a rapid river in the mountains. Poof! There was a loud sound and water splashed everywhere. The two of them fell directly into the rapid river and disappeared in an instant. Chapter 62. The rapid river instantly drowned the two of them. A bone-piercing chill surged over, like a knife piercing into their flesh. Xian struggled with all her might, but her body was involuntarily swept forward by the current. She was like a piece of withered leaf in the water, constantly bumping into the hard rocks at the bottom of the river, and at the same time she could not breathe. She became more and more panicked, only feeling that everything in front of her was pitch black. There was only endless terrifying torrents in front of her, as if the next moment she could fall into a bottomless dark abyss. She could not help but cry out loudly, but before she could cry out, the moment she opened her mouth, the cold river water poured into her mouth, immediately suppressing all sounds. She choked on a large mouthful of water, violently coughing. At the same time her body was even more panicked, like a stiff rolling log in the water, rampaging about. But at this time, an arm stretched out from the side, hugging her body from behind. Xianxia was like a drowning person grabbing onto the last straw. Her entire body leaned over, at the same time as she violently coughed, her hands tightly grabbing onto that arm. "Don't move." A low voice sounded in her ear. Another body leaned over in the water, hugging her, letting her head out of the water so she could breathe, while floating down with the current. Xianxia greedily took in large mouthfuls of air, and then gradually became clear-headed and calmed down. She no longer moved casually and just nestled in the arms of the strange man. In this mournful and austere night, in this desolate and uninhabited wilderness, she drifted along with the flow. For a moment, she seemed to have thought of something. She turned around and looked at the direction she came from. In the depths of the darkness, at the foot of the hill, she could vaguely see a group of ferocious figures squeezing on the riverbank, letting out angry and violent roars. The current was very fast, but Lu Chen's swimming skills seemed to be quite good. Even with a burden like Xianxia, he was still able to swim with ease in the river. At the same time, the rapid current carried the two of them away from the hillside, all the way down, disappearing into the distance in this deep night. But looking at that direction, they were drifting further and further away from the path they came from, all the way into an even darker mountain range. After an unknown period of time, the river gradually calmed down. At the same time, the surface of the water widened. The wild cries of those black jackals were long gone. Only the darkness between the heavens and the earth remained the same. Xianxia felt Lu Chen start to paddle with his arms, bringing her upstream. At this moment, after several consecutive shocks and back and forth from the gates of hell, she felt extremely exhausted, but there was still a string in her mind that was tightly wound. As long as the night did not subside, as long as she was still in this terrifying wilderness of the land of confusion, she would feel a kind of fear from the bottom of her heart, and did not dare to sleep. After a while, Lu Chen brought Xianxia to the side of the river, and they walked. Splash! There was a clear sound, that was the sound of water splashing down from their bodies. The two of them were already completely drenched. Lu Chen did not seem to feel anything, but when Xianxia stood on the riverbank and was blown by the night wind, she immediately felt a bone-chilling cold and could not help but shiver a few times. Lu Chen glanced at her, walked to Xianxia's side and said, "Can you still hold on?" Xianxia forced a smile and said, "I'm fine." After saying this, she suddenly realized that because her clothes were completely drenched, they were tightly clinging to her body, revealing all the exquisite curves of her body, making her look especially alluring. Xianxia felt her face suddenly heat up, and she subconsciously let out an "ah" and reached out to cover her body. Who knew that as soon as she raised her hand, an indescribably intense pain suddenly came from her left arm. Xianxia only felt her vision go black, and she staggered, almost falling to the ground, and her mouth also let out a painful groan. Lu Chen supported her, a little surprised, and asked, "What's wrong?" Xianxia was in so much pain that even her voice sounded a little shaky, and she said with a trembling voice, "My hand, my left hand." Lu Chen looked over and reached out to support her arm for a moment, and then immediately frowned and said, "It's broken." Xianxia bit her lip, lightly gasping for breath. In her mind, the scene of her escape just now replayed in her mind, but she found that she could not remember where exactly it was that broke her arm. Perhaps it was because she was too nervous and excited, or because she had suffered too many injuries on the way, so she did not immediately notice that her arm was broken. Lu Chen looked around, and after a moment of silence, said, "Sit down first, and rest for a while." Xianxia used her right hand to support her left arm, found a stone on the riverbank, and sat down, while Lu Chen walked to a place a little further away, where there were a few trees. He fiddled there for a while, and after a moment, came back with a branch about 2 fingers wide. At the moment, he was holding a black dagger in his hand, and it looked quite sharp. Xianxia watched him cut off all the branches and leaves, leaving only a round wooden trunk, and then he gestured to her arm. "Do you have medicine on you?" Lu Chen asked Xianxia. Xianxia shook her head and said in a low voice, "I only have some medicine to stop bleeding, and no medicine to set bones." Lu Chen nodded and didn't say anything else. He tore off a few pieces of cloth from his clothes, and then straightened Xian's arm so that the broken bones were in place, and tied her arm to the tree trunk. Let's do this for now. When the sun rises, we'll look around to see if there are any suitable herbs for you to apply. Lu Chen said calmly. In the process of tying her arm, it was naturally unavoidable to touch the broken bones, and Xian suffered a lot. But at least she knew that Lu Chen was doing this for her own good, and so she endured the pain, but her eyes were already filled with tears, and her face was incomparably pale. When Lu Chen was finally done, Xian let out a long sigh of relief, and then timidly said, "Thank you very much, Brother Lu." Lu Chen looked at her and said, "It's very dangerous here in the disorienting lands at night, and we can't easily light a fire. Otherwise, it'll easily attract troublesome and powerful demonic beasts. We can only wait like this until the sun rises. Can you still hold on?" Xian gritted her teeth. Although she felt a sharp pain in her arm and waves of cold constantly invaded her skin, she still nodded and said, "I can." Lu Chen grunted and walked to a spot a few feet away from Xian and directly lay down on the ground, saying, "Then let's rest and wait for the sun to rise." Xian sat there in a daze for a while. Although she was extremely tired, she didn't know why, but she didn't feel the slightest bit sleepy. Looking at the deep night sky between the mountains and the dark river not far away, she suddenly felt like crying. It was at this moment that Lu Chen's voice suddenly sounded from beside her. "That's right, where are your two companions? How are they?" Chapter 63. They. In the dark of the night, although Xian was sitting not far away, her figure was somewhat blurry. At this moment, her voice sounded a little trembling and deep, as if Lu Chen's words had suddenly poked at a certain part of her heart. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. "Did you encounter a pack of black jackals at the waterfall?" Xian slowly lowered her head. After a while, she said, "Yes, after you left, not long after, a large group of black jackals suddenly rushed over. There were too many of them, and I couldn't even count them all." Her breathing suddenly became a little hurried, as if she was being stabbed by memories. She said in a low voice, "Martial uncle, senior martial brother, and I fought in a hurry. Although we had our backs against the wall of the mountain, there were too many demonic beasts. After fighting for a long time, we still couldn't hold on. Uncle Master told us to split up and run. He said that one of us could escape." At this point, her voice was choked with sobs. After a pause, she continued, "Senior brother and I rushed out. In the middle, I turned around and saw Uncle Master being pounced on by a large group of black jackals. In the blink of an eye, flesh and blood flew everywhere. I was terrified. Senior brother, he pulled me and ran with all his might, but there were black jackals chasing after us. In the end, senior brother, he and I had no choice but to split up and run for our lives. The last time I saw him, there were more than 10 black jackals pouncing on him. Then they were blocked by the trees. I only heard a series of screams and wild dogs barking." In the darkness, Lu Chen was silent for a moment before saying, "What about you? Why were you the only one who escaped in the end?" Xian said in a daze, "I ran for a while and saw that I was about to be caught again. But at this moment, I suddenly remembered that before I went down the mountain, Master had given me a blinding talisman. So I climbed up a tree and used this talisman. The black jackals chased me nearby and couldn't find me." At this point, Xian suddenly burst into tears and cried, "It's all my fault, it's all my fault. If I had thought of this earlier, martial uncle and senior brother might not have died." Lu Chen was silent and didn't say anything. He let Xian cry for a while. After her sobs calmed down a little, he said indifferently, "This isn't your fault. And even if you used this talisman in advance, when the black jackals were right in front of you, with the keen senses of those demon beasts, you still wouldn't be able to escape." Xian's body trembled as she whispered, "Really?" "Yes." Lu Chen responded, then turned over and said, "It's getting late, hurry up and sleep. We might have to climb mountains and wade rivers for the whole day tomorrow. If you don't sleep, your body won't be able to take it." Xian's lips moved slightly. After a moment, she still slowly lay down on the grass by the river bank. Her mind was in a mess, and her heart was filled with regret and fear. She thought that she wouldn't be able to fall asleep no matter what, but who knew that as she lay down, she would unknowingly close her eyes and fall asleep. The morning sun fell on the riverbank, shining on the sleeping woman's face. Although her face was still a little pale and the ends of her hair were messy, a strand of beautiful hair still hung down from her temples and slid down to her nose, bringing with it a bit of languid beauty. Her slender and long eyelashes trembled a few times in the golden brilliance, and then Xianxia slowly opened her eyes. For a moment, she seemed to still be in the warm home of her memories. Her kind master and close senior and junior sisters were still by her side. Someone was smiling and saying something to her, and when she was full of joy and wanted to sit up and answer, a sudden pain came from her left arm, waking her up from the illusion. Hiss! Xianxia sucked in a breath of cold air and bit her lips. This time, the pain was so severe that she almost cried out. At the same time, a voice came from not far away. Be careful, don't make the injured bone crooked, otherwise you'll suffer again. Xianxia panted a few times and didn't dare to move her left arm. She sat up straight and looked to the side. She saw that Lu Chen had already woken up and was walking over from the other side of the forest. He was holding a lot of things in his hands. It looked like some random weeds that Xianxia didn't recognize, and in the middle, there were some strange dark brown things. Lu Chen walked to Xianxia's side and squatted down to put the things in his hands to the side. Then he grabbed Xianxia's left arm and examined it. He nodded and said to her, I'll help you apply some medicine now. It should heal faster, but there will be some pain. Endure it yourself. When Xianxia heard the word, pain, her heart skipped a beat. She was a little afraid, but looking at Lu Chen's calm face, she didn't know why she couldn't say no for a moment. Moreover, no matter how she looked at it, this man was doing it for her own good. So, after hesitating for a moment, she still slowly nodded. Lu Chen gently untied the wooden stick from her arm and then tore her sleeve. On her white wrist, the area around the broken arm was already red and swollen. Lu Chen frowned and lowered his head to gather the herbs he had picked and mashed them together, including the strange black things. Xianxia glanced at his hands. Suddenly, her eyes straightened and she saw that the black things were actually some strange insect eggs that she couldn't name. They were black and fat and looked very disgusting. Xianxia was shocked and suddenly felt nauseous. She almost vomited and cried out, What are these things? What do you want to do with them? The larvae of the golden-winged bee. Lu Chen glanced at her and said faintly, Don't talk nonsense. This is good stuff. It can at least speed up the recovery of your broken arm by several times. You're lucky to be able to find it here. Xianxia was stunned and speechless. She wanted to say something, but she swallowed the words that were about to come out of her mouth. It was just that she had never seen these disgusting things before. When she saw that Lu Chen had actually mashed the insect eggs together with the herbs, she suddenly couldn't stand it. She quickly turned her face away and took a few deep breaths before she slowly recovered. Not long after, Xianxia suddenly felt a cool sensation on her arm. Then, Lu Chen smeared a layer of sticky stuff on the wound of her broken arm. Xianxia didn't dare to look at the wound. After a while, she felt that Lu Chen first wrapped it with a cloth and then tied her arm to the wooden stick again. It's done. Lu Chen stood up and said to her, As long as there are no accidents, he should be fine in about 7 or 8 days. Let's get up and continue our journey. Xianxia gritted her teeth and stood up. She forced herself not to look at her left arm and said, Where are we going? Lu Chen said, I don't know. Let me see the direction and terrain first. Xianxia was taken aback and said, Aren't you a guide? You should be very familiar with the Black Armor Mountain, right? Lu Chen looked at the woman snappily and said, Of course I'm familiar with the vicinity of the Black Armor Mountain. But even if I'm a guide, I can't jump into the torrent to explore the terrain, right? I've never been to this area. Xianxia was speechless. At the same time, she also felt that she had said something wrong. If it wasn't for saving her, perhaps he actually didn't need to jump into the river last night. Thinking of this, her cheeks became a little hot. She subconsciously turned her head away and looked elsewhere. Who knew that as she turned her gaze, Xianxia suddenly saw a pair of ferocious eyes looking at them from behind a dense thicket of grass in front of them. There was a trace of viciousness in that fierce gaze, almost no different from that of a demon beast, causing Exen to jump in fright. She suddenly took a step back and pointed in that direction, crying out involuntarily, "There's someone over there." Chapter 64. What? Lu Chen was taken aback. He turned around and asked Exen. Exen hurriedly pointed at the bushes and said anxiously, I just saw something in the bushes." Before she finished speaking, Exen's voice suddenly stopped. She looked in that direction with a trace of surprise. She saw that the bushes were still the same, but she didn't see the pair of fierce eyes that she just saw. Lu Chen looked in the direction that Exen pointed. He looked at the bushes and frowned slightly. He then walked over. Exen didn't know why, but she suddenly felt nervous. She also followed behind him, and at the same time, her eyes kept looking left and right. The two walked to the edge of the bushes. They saw that the bushes were lush, about a person's knee height. But at the moment, the bushes were empty. It was obviously impossible for someone to hide inside. Lu Chen pondered for a moment. He broke a branch from the side and patted the nearby bushes for a while. He only saw a few flying insects, but he still didn't see the figure that Exen said. Lu Chen looked back at Exen. Exen's cheeks were slightly red. For a moment, she was not very confident. She thought, could it be that I was too tired yesterday, so my mind is not very clear now? What I saw just now, was it just an illusion? Lu Chen walked back to her side and didn't say much. He just calmly said, "Since there is nothing, then let's hurry." Exen responded with some embarrassment. Lu Chen nodded and walked forward. Exen looked at the bushes again. She saw that the surroundings were quiet, as if there was really nothing. But she carefully thought about it. She remembered that the pair of fierce and vicious eyes in the bushes was particularly clear. She couldn't help but shiver. With such a delay, Lu Chen had already walked a distance. He then noticed something and turned around to call out to Exen. Exen quickly responded. She shook off the inexplicable thought in her mind and quickly chased after Lu Chen. As the two of them gradually walked further away, a light breeze suddenly blew from the surface of the river, passing through the silent depths of the wild grass. The verdant leaves of the grass and trees trembled slightly like waves, faintly making out a blurry shadow, flashing past the grass and leaves in the distance. Lu Chen didn't go up the river with Exen. Instead, they went downstream. After walking for a while, Exen noticed this and asked Lu Chen about it. Lu Chen's answer was also very straightforward. It was easier to go downstream. If they went upstream, they would have to enter several mountain ranges, including the Black Armor Mountain. There were all kinds of demon beasts and unknown dangers in the mountains. It was very troublesome. Even if they found the way back to the Black Armor Mountain, it was unlikely that they could go back the way they came. Because demon beasts like black jackals were very vengeful, the large group of ferocious wild dogs was probably still waiting in the mountains. As long as the direction was right, they could also get out of the chaotic land by going downstream, and there would be less danger on the way. In the current situation, Exen didn't have much of a mind of her own. Moreover, after last night's escape, she had developed a lot of trust in Lu Chen, who she had only known for a few days. After all, he saved her life and healed her injuries. Even if he wanted to harm her, he would have done what he should have done last night. Therefore, she quickly accepted this reality and obediently followed Lu Chen downstream. It was a sunny day in late autumn. The river was calm and clear, and the hills on both sides of the river were undulating. It looked like a painting, not at all like the legendary land of confusion that was known to be filled with countless dangers and dangers. After walking for about half an hour, they walked along the river into a valley. Suddenly, they saw a colorful scene in front of them. Taking a closer look, it turned out to be a piece of land with a radius of several acres, covered with all kinds of colorful strange flowers. The flowers were delicate and beautiful, and each flower was extremely large. The smallest one seemed to be the size of a wash basin. Blooming under the sun, it was like a strange land of rainbows that fell into the human world. Exen opened her eyes wide and couldn't help exclaiming, "Ah, it's so beautiful here. So many beautiful flowers." Before she could finish her words, she suddenly heard Lu Chen's faint voice beside her. "If you don't want to die, then stay further away from that side." Exen turned her head back in shock, her mouth half agape. Why? Lu Chen didn't even turn his head back as he walked forward. His body neared the riverside and distanced himself from the cluster of flowers. At the same time, he said, "This is a bloodthirsty demon flower. Usually, it uses its flowers to lure living creatures. As long as there's a prey that comes near, countless sharp thorns will break out from the ground and pull the prey back. At the same time, the thorns have a strange poison. It's not fatal, but it can make the prey's entire body weak and unable to move. After it's dragged back to the cluster of flowers, it will turn into a bloody pulp." His words were said calmly, but Xianxia was dumbstruck. Her face turned pale and revealed a look of fear. When she looked at the beautiful cluster of flowers again, she couldn't help but shiver and said in a low voice, "Why? Why are there so many monsters here?" Lu Chen glanced at her and shook his head without saying a word. He turned and continued to walk forward. Xianxia was a little discouraged. She sighed and followed him. The two of them walked along the river and bypassed the seemingly beautiful land of demonic flowers. After walking for a while and seeing that they were about to walk out of the valley where the bloodthirsty demonic flowers were hidden, they suddenly heard a low whine coming from the side. It sounded a little mournful, and it was somewhat similar to the cry of the black jackal yesterday. Xianxia's first reaction was that her hair stood on end. She almost jumped up. Yesterday, she was almost killed by those terrible black jackals, so she was almost allergic to this kind of terrible sound. However, in comparison, Lu Chen was much calmer. He first grabbed Xianxia, who was about to rush forward to escape, and pulled her to his side. At the same time, he frowned and looked to the side of the valley exit. Xianxia was still in a state of shock, but she felt at ease when she felt Lu Chen's hand beside her. She looked over and was stunned. There was no black jackal on the ground. No, there seemed to be a wild dog. It wasn't big, and it looked like half a puppy at most. The fur on its body was black, but it was lighter than the black jackal demonic beasts from yesterday. It seemed a little different. Especially on its back, from the back of its head and neck down to its back, there was a long and narrow white fur band. It was very clear, showing that this puppy was not a black jackal. After Xianxia looked carefully for a while, she saw even more strangeness. The puppy was lying on the ground, unable to move. It could only cry out mournfully, looking especially pitiful and helpless. One of its legs was dragging behind it. Unlike the other 3 legs, it seemed to be broken. The puppy lay there with a blank look in its eyes, as if it was about to run out of oil. Even its sorrowful cries gradually became softer. It seemed that if no one helped it, it would die here in a short while. It looks so pitiful. Xianxia couldn't help but say. When Lu Chen heard her words, he quickly frowned and looked at the woman indifferently. Chapter 65. Xianxia suddenly felt a little guilty when he suddenly looked at her like this. After hesitating for a moment, she softly asked with a trace of unconfidence, "Brother Lu, this puppy, could it be a powerful demonic beast that can harm our lives at any time?" Lu Chen glanced in that direction and said indifferently, "Such a small thing, of course it can't kill us." Xianxia let out a sigh of relief, as if her suspended heart had finally been put down. "Then let's save it, okay?" Lu Chen snorted and said, "You were chased half to death by a pack of black jackals yesterday. How can you be so merciful today?" Xianxia was startled and said, "Is this puppy also a black jackal? When I saw it just now, I thought it wasn't. It really isn't a purebred black jackal demonic beast." Lu Chen interrupted Xianxia's words and said, "This is a hybrid between a mountain snow wolf and a black jackal. It is rare for it to survive and grow up. Even if you save it, it would be a waste." Xianxia was stunned and said, "Why?" Lu Chen wanted to say something but stopped. For some reason, his expression suddenly became gloomy, as if he was a little unhappy. Even his voice had a rare trace of impatience as he said, "In short, it still has the blood of a black jackal. Do you want to save it?" Xianxia was shouted at by him and immediately shrank back. After a while, she timidly said, "I'll listen to you." Lu Chen snorted and turned to leave. Xianxia sighed softly and followed. From time to time, the puppy's sorrowful cries could be heard from behind her. Xianxia could not bear to see it, but reason told her that Lu Chen's method might be the right choice, so she resisted the urge to look back. The two of them walked all the way out of the river valley, and the puppy finally disappeared from their line of sight. At the same time, the river made a big turn here and continued flowing in another direction. Lu Chen stopped in his tracks. He raised his head and looked around. He then looked up at the sky as if he was trying to figure out the direction and the terrain. Exen hesitated as she waited, but she couldn't help but take advantage of this opportunity to sneak a few steps towards the river valley. She stuck her head out and looked at the place where Lu Chen had been. However, with this glance, Exen suddenly let out a soft cry. Then she used her uninjured hand to cover her mouth, her eyes filled with shock. Lu Chen immediately noticed Exen's unusual behavior and turned around to look at her. Then he frowned. In the distance, near the broken leg of the puppy, a large yellow leopard suddenly appeared. It bared its sharp fangs and slowly approached the puppy. At the same time, its eyes were filled with greed. The puppy let out a mournful cry, as if sensing the impending disaster, desperately struggling to shrink back. However, one of its broken legs was dragging on the ground, and no matter how hard it tried to crawl away, it was only a feeble struggle before death. The yellow leopard clearly saw through the puppy's weakness. But as a monster, it still had some vigilance. It first looked around to see if there were any enemies nearby. At the same time, it was also very afraid of the bloodthirsty demon flowers, so it kept a long distance. The puppy was about 30 feet away from the bloodthirsty demon flowers. The yellow leopard looked at the flowers and seemed to determine that this distance was enough to not disturb the flowers. With a low growl, its body suddenly soared into the air and pounced towards the puppy. The puppy let out a mournful cry. In the distance, Exen's body trembled. She couldn't help but close her eyes, not daring to look again. But at this moment, a black shadow suddenly flew out from nowhere, streaked across the air and directly smashed into the area between the puppy and the bloodthirsty demon flowers. Lu Chen looked over and his pupils suddenly constricted. He saw that the thing that was suddenly thrown out was a bloody piece of meat. There seemed to be a light breeze, gently blowing past. In the vast empty space in the river valley, everything suddenly quietened down. Almost in that instant, the yellow leopard who was already in the air suddenly let out an angry roar. But the ground in front of him suddenly shook violently. Near that piece of meat, a boom sound was heard. Several thick vines full of thorns broke out from the ground and rushed out, wrapping around that piece of meat. But that piece of meat was too small and it did not move at all. The vines wiggled a few times and instantly seemed to sense something and turned in a different direction. This time, it was towards the yellow leopard who had leapt into the air. The ferocity in the yellow leopard's eyes was no longer there. Right now it was filled with fear. How could it still care about that puppy? With a mournful cry, it landed on the ground and was about to run away with its tail between its legs. However, those extremely terrifying vines arrived with a loud bang. Their speed was fast, almost like lightning. Wherever they passed, sand and stones flew. Only a rumbling sound mixed with sharp howls could be heard. A moment later, amidst the yellow leopard's angry roar, it was actually caught by those vines just as it was about to run out of the boundary and then slowly dragged back. The yellow leopard screamed and screamed, struggling with all its might. However, the vines wrapped around it and not long after, countless of thorns pierced into the yellow leopard's flesh. Gradually, its voice became lower and lower. Its struggling became smaller and smaller until it finally reached a state of limp helplessness. At this time, a black rope suddenly flew out. There was a sharp claw attached to the rope and it accurately landed on the yellow leopard's hind leg. Then, it suddenly grabbed tightly and the sharp blade instantly cut open the yellow leopard's flesh. The yellow leopard let out a mournful cry as one of its hind legs was separated from its body. Strangely, the bloodthirsty demon flowers did not have any reaction to this. They continued to drag the yellow leopard, who was on its last breath, and continued to walk backwards. Not long after, they dragged it to the incomparably gorgeous flower field. After wriggling for a while, it once again became quiet. The rope that was holding the leopard's leg fell to the ground and also slowly retracted. At the same time, a figure walked out and unhappily spat. He grabbed the leopard's leg with one hand and the puppy with the broken leg with the other, then turned around and left. Under the sunlight, this person looked like an evil spirit that had just walked out of the Yellow Springs. His body was bent and his skin was dark and cracked. He was almost like a skeleton with only skin and bones. And on that terrifying face, 2 broken fangs protruded from the side of his mouth, making him look more like a beast than a human. As he left, this strange person seemed to think of something. He suddenly turned around and looked in the direction of the valley's exit. However, he saw that it was empty and there was no sign of anyone. He muttered something as if he was cursing something viciously. Then, he grabbed the bloody leg and quickly disappeared into the valley. No one knew where he went. After a long time, Lu Chen and Xianxia's figures slowly appeared behind the stone wall of the valley's exit. Lu Chen's hand was tightly covering Xianxia's mouth. Xianxia's eyes were filled with shock, as if she could not understand what had just happened. On the other hand, Lu Chen's expression was rather cold. He looked coldly at the river valley as if he was thinking about something. After a while, he suddenly said in a low voice, "Barbarians?" Chapter 66. Xianxia was so shocked by what she had just seen that her heart was still pounding, so she did not hear Lu Chen's words clearly. She asked in a low voice, "Who are you talking about?" However, Lu Chen's hand was still covering her mouth, causing her words to sound muffled. Only then did Lu Chen realize that and let go of his hand. Xianxia heaved a sigh of relief. After taking a few breaths, she looked at the place where the bloodthirsty demon flower had been and could not help but turn pale. If Lu Chen hadn't stopped her, and if the 2 of them had walked up to the puppy with a broken leg and thrown that bloody piece of meat at it, Xianxia didn't even dare to imagine what the consequences would have been. "This place is too dangerous. Let's go," Xianxia said to Lu Chen in a low voice. At the same time, she swore to herself that she would never come to a place like this again. However, Lu Chen did not seem to have any intention of leaving immediately. He looked coldly in the direction that the mysterious black figure had disappeared in. It was a dense forest, and no one knew where it led to. "Let's go and take a look." When she heard the first half of Lu Chen's words, Xianxia heaved a sigh of relief and a gratified expression appeared on her face. However, before the smile could fully appear on her pretty face, her expression froze again. What are we going to see?" she stuttered. Lu Chen did not speak and walked towards the forest in the valley. He looked calm, but when Xianxia looked at him from the side, she noticed that his eyes seemed to be exceptionally bright. There was even an icy coldness that she had never felt from this man before. It was as if a sharp blade was slowly being unsheathed, emitting the scent of blood. A barbarian who strayed from the group in the disorienting lands. A low voice seemed to come from his mouth. It sounded like he was talking to himself, but it also sounded like he was laughing coldly. Xianxia stood rooted to the ground. For a moment, she was at a loss. From the bloody and violent scene just now, the mysterious black figure hiding in the dark was obviously very ferocious. It would be very dangerous to go and look for it rashly. However, she did not understand why Lu Chen, who had been very cautious most of the time, would suddenly act out of character and insist on finding trouble with the black figure. Wouldn't it be better to just leave this place? After all, neither of them were injured, right? She hesitated for a long time. When she looked up, she realized that Lu Chen had already walked far away. Seeing that he was about to reach the edge of the forest, Xianxia could not help but feel a little afraid. She didn't have much worldly experience, so she was a little afraid of the disorienting lands after last night's experience. Lu Chen was her most trustworthy backer at the moment. At that moment, she couldn't help but call out, "Big brother Lu, wait for me." As she spoke, she jogged to catch up to him. Walking into the forest, Xianxia felt that the surrounding light had suddenly dimmed. The temperature was also slightly lower than outside. She guessed that it was because the forest was too dense. There were many short shrubs in the forest. Who knew how many years of fallen leaves had formed a thick layer on the ground? When she walked on it, she felt that it was soft under her feet. The air was filled with the smell of the leaves and rotten soil under her feet. It didn't take Lu Chen much effort to find a hidden path in the forest, and then he walked along it. The path was intermittent and strange. Sometimes, it would suddenly disappear. However, no one knew what kind of strange ability Lu Chen had. Every time this happened, he would carefully observe the surroundings and find some traces in some inconspicuous corner. From there, he would rediscover the path. Some of the traces were faint blood stains from the short leaves. Some were leaves that had just fallen. There were even some that were almost unrecognizable footprints on the withered leaves. However, Lu Chen still managed to find them one by one. Xianxia followed behind Lu Chen. Her eyes were filled with shock and horror. Ever since she was young, she had embarked on the path of immortal cultivation. All she knew was cultivation techniques. At most, she would spar with her fellow disciples. She had never seen anything like this before. She looked at the back of the man in front of her and suddenly felt a sense of trepidation. If one day she became this man's prey, she would definitely have nowhere to run, right? She could vaguely sense that this man named Lu Chen seemed to exist on the other side of the cultivation world that she was familiar with. Before coming to the chaotic lands, she knew nothing about the things in that dark world. Lu Chen's movements were practiced and efficient. Sometimes, his movements were so sharp that Xianxia felt that there were some hidden traces. It was as if he knew the location beforehand and found it with incredible speed. Or perhaps, he seemed to be familiar with the habits of the black shadow in front of him. About an hour later, Lu Chen suddenly stopped in his tracks and stopped Xianxia. In front of them, outside the dense thicket, there was an open space about half an acre in size. A large boulder abruptly rose up to form a slope, and under the boulder was a cave entrance. The ground outside the cave was a mess. There were things that looked like garbage everywhere. There were charred stones, broken wooden sticks, and bones of different sizes. At a cursory glance, most of them were small animal bones. Huff! A strange sound came from the cave. It sounded like heavy breathing. Not long after, a black shadow walked out. It was indeed the strange man who had appeared in the Valley of the Bloodthirsty Demon Flowers. Now that they were closer, Lu Chen and Xianxia could see more clearly than before. Soon, they realized that this person wasn't young. Apart from the fact that he was all skin and bones, even his gait made him look like an old man who was out of breath. But even so, this strange man's ferociousness didn't diminish at all. When he walked out, he was still holding the bloody leopard's leg in his hand. He sat on a huge rock and opened his mouth to chew on it. Blood flowed down the corner of his mouth. He looked like a wild beast. Xianxia's body trembled. She felt a wave of nausea in her stomach. She almost vomited from this scene. Fortunately, she knew that this was not the time. She forced herself to bear with it. But she did not dare to look at this barbaric man drinking blood. She shrank her body back. Just as she was about to tell Lu Chen not to cause trouble and leave first, her body suddenly froze. Lu Chen had already vanished from her side at some point in time. Xianxia was shocked. She turned her head and looked around. After a while, she suddenly realized that Lu Chen's figure was already at the edge of the shrubs not far from the cave. He was right behind the strange man and was slowly approaching. The straight line distance between the two seemed to be less than 10 feet. For a moment, Xianxia only felt that her heart was suddenly in her throat. She was so nervous that she even held her breath. Around the cave, it was even more silent. Only the strange man seemed to be unknowingly gnawing on flesh and blood like a wild beast. However, amidst this tranquility, a wave of miserable dog barks suddenly resounded from within the cave, and it broke the silence here. Chapter 67. Lu Chen, who had been slowly approaching, suddenly stopped in his tracks. Xianxia, who was lying in the bushes further away, felt a buzzing sound in her head and her mind went blank. Her heart was beating so fast that it felt like it was about to explode. On the other side of the cave, the strange man who was gnawing on the leopard's leg also stopped for a moment. He suddenly raised his head but did not turn around. Instead, he roared, "Stupid dog, shut up." As he spoke, he fiercely bit down on the flesh on his hand and then cursed vaguely, "You're lucky today. You didn't catch the woman you wanted to catch, but a yellow leopard came to throw its life away. After I finish eating this leopard's leg, if I still can't catch anything, I'll eat you too." The barking in the cave slowly subsided. It was unknown whether it was because the little dog was frightened or because it was heavily injured and had no strength left. The strange man sneered. After eating a lot of meat, he seemed to be in better spirits. Although he still looked old and decrepit, the greedy and ferocious look in his eyes became more intense. He muttered to himself, "Damn it! If I had caught that woman today, I could have. What could I have done?" Suddenly, a cold voice came from behind him. The strange man was so shocked that he almost dropped the leopard's leg in his hand. He suddenly turned around and saw a man standing behind him. Moreover, the man's face was somewhat familiar. It was the man who had spied on him during the day. The strange man let out a ferocious roar. He jumped up and directly used the leopard's leg as a weapon to smash it towards Lu Chen. His momentum was like that of an enraged beast. However, his body had only jumped halfway when he suddenly felt a chill in his waist, followed by a burst of sharp pain. The strange man immediately let out a heart-wrenching scream. When he looked down, he saw that a black dagger had pierced into his waist at some point. His jump with all his strength just now had directly cut a shocking large wound on his back. Red blood instantly gushed out like a blood fountain, but it quickly weakened. It was as if the old and decrepit body had long lost its vitality. The strange man staggered backwards, his mouth constantly letting out angry roars. However, it seemed that his already weakened and decayed body could no longer bear such a heavy wound. Not long after, he fell heavily to the ground, gasping for breath and struggling. At the same time, he used an unimaginably vicious gaze to stare fiercely at the man who suddenly appeared. Xianxia ran over from the side, and when her eyes met the strange man's terrifying gaze, she was so scared that her face turned pale. She didn't dare to look at the beast-like man any longer, and ran to Lu Chen's side like a wisp of smoke. "Are you all right?" Lu Chen glanced at her and shook his head, and then he pointed at the ferocious man and said, "The trap in the river valley was supposed to harm us." Xianxia's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she did not know what to say. She only saw Lu Chen smile coldly. He slowly walked to the strange man's side with the black dagger in his hand and squatted down. The strange man's body subconsciously shrank back, but he still stared at Lu Chen with a fierce gaze. If looks could kill, Lu Chen would have been killed countless times by him. However, Lu Chen did not seem to feel anything. At most, he only showed a trace of disgust and said, "You better behave." The strange man's body and face were covered with blood, looking especially ferocious and terrifying. Hearing this, he laughed sinisterly and scolded, "Get lost, I will eat you." A mournful scream suddenly came out of his mouth again. Xianxia, who was standing not far away, was shocked. She turned to look, only to see Lu Chen's expressionless face, seemingly unmoved by the strange man's miserable state. In his hand, the black short sword had already pierced into the strange man's thigh, and with a twist, it tore a large hole in the man's leg. The strange man roared and screamed. He rolled around on the ground and screamed himself hoarse. Xianxia only felt her hair stand on end. At the same time, she could not bear it. She walked over and secretly pulled on Lu Chen's sleeve. She softly said, "Lu, brother Lu, don't be like this." Lu Chen turned back to look at her and suddenly said, "Do you know who he is?" Xianxia felt a little scared under his gaze. She did not know why, but at this moment, although she could feel that Lu Chen did not have any hostility towards her, she still felt a little afraid of him. She was even more afraid of Lu Chen than that ferocious strange man. She lowered her head and softly said, "I don't know. He is a barbarian." Lu Chen's voice sounded in her ear. His calm voice seemed to have a trace of coldness. Xianxia was shocked and said, "Barbarian? Didn't the barbarians retreat to the southern wilderness after they were defeated in the war 1,000 years ago?" Lu Chen glanced at the old barbarian who was still screaming miserably on the ground and said, "Most of the barbarian tribes have retreated, but the 1,000-year war was too intense. Even some of the passages and mountain ranges were destroyed by those powerful true sovereigns and true ones. So, there are still some barbarians left in the chaotic lands." This was the first time Xianxia heard of this. She was stunned for a long time before she said in surprise, "So there is such a thing. But I have never heard of the barbarian tribes in the chaotic lands." Lu Chen said, The remaining barbarians mostly live in the form of tribes and live in the depths of the chaotic lands. They will not easily come to the outskirts. It is not strange that you do not know of them. Exen hesitated for a moment and said, I heard that the deeper you go into the chaotic lands, the more dangerous it gets. If that is the case, why don't the barbarians come to the outskirts? Isn't it better to live there? Lu Chen said indifferently, because in the chaotic lands, in the eyes of the barbarians, we human cultivators are more dangerous than the demonic beasts in the chaotic lands. Exen was stunned and subconsciously wanted to refute. In her impression, although there were good and bad people among all the cultivators she had met, there were rarely people like the Devil King who killed without blinking an eye. To be more precise, she had never seen such a cultivator in all her years of cultivation. But just as the words were about to leave her mouth, she suddenly saw the man in front of her and swallowed them back down. She lowered her head and said, Don't they have their own tribes? Why is there only one person here? And why did he come to the outskirts where there are many human cultivators? The depths of the chaotic lands are extremely dangerous. Although the barbarians have gathered into tribes, it is not easy for them to survive. So for many years, they have developed a custom. The elders of the tribe who are old and weak and can no longer hunt in the central regions of the chaotic lands have to leave the tribe and fend for themselves. Exine slowly opened her mouth. She felt a chill run down her spine and a patch of icy white faintly appeared in front of her eyes. It was as if the beautiful world in front of her had suddenly been flipped upside down, revealing a cruel and cold side. Lu Chen's calm voice continued, This should be the case for these barbarians. Because they are old and weak, they cannot stay in the central regions of the chaotic lands where the demonic beasts are extremely dangerous. They can only slowly migrate to the outskirts and settle down in this river valley in the outskirts. They wait for their deaths while harming others. As Lu Chen spoke, he glanced at Exen and saw the expression on her face. He suddenly said, You heard it just now, right? That trap was meant to capture you. Do you want to know what will happen to you if he captures you alive? Exine looked at him blankly. Looking at Lu Chen's calm yet deep eyes, she suddenly felt a bone-piercing cold, as if she had fallen into an ice house. Chapter 68. What will happen? Exine asked in a low voice. Lu Chen looked at her face and slowly said, If you fall into a trap and are captured alive, without any ability to fight back, he will first rape you, then chop your body into pieces and slowly eat them. He pointed at the bloody leopard's leg on the ground and expressionlessly said, Just like that thing. Blarg! Exen looked at the leopard's leg and finally could not bear it anymore. Her body trembled as she rushed to the bushes at the side. She bent her body and retched. Her face was as pale as paper. Lu Chen quietly looked at her. He did not comfort her, nor did he continue to say those cruel words. After a while, Exen seemed to slowly calm down. She panted as she straightened her body and walked back step by step. She didn't dare to look at the dirty and ferocious old barbarian anymore. She didn't even dare to look at the leopard's leg on the ground. She only timidly walked to Lu Chen's side. After hesitating for a while, she said in a low voice, Big brother Lu, let's go, okay. This time, Lu Chen unexpectedly agreed to her straightforwardly. This made Exine feel a little strange. But then, she saw Lu Chen turn around and walk towards the barbarian who was moaning on the ground. This man did not roar, did not scold, and did not overflow with killing intent. Even his expression did not seem to change. But Exen felt that the surrounding temperature suddenly became a little colder. The barbarian old man seemed to have sensed something as well. He howled in pain and cursed angrily. His body shrank back with all his might, leaving behind a trail of blood on the ground. But all of this was useless. Lu Chen quickly walked in front of him. Then, under the horrified gaze of Exen, he raised the black dagger and stabbed it. The incomparably sharp blade instantly pierced through the barbarian's flesh and stabbed into the barbarian's heart. The old barbarian's entire body tensed up and curled up. He shouted some strange and unclear words. After a while, the dirty and ferocious head drooped down. His body stiffened and he stopped breathing. Lu Chen pulled out his sword and walked back. His expression was indifferent, as if he had just done something very normal. He said to Xian, "You can go now." Xian blankly nodded. She looked at Lu Chen and suddenly felt an impulse in her heart. She could not help but ask, "Brother Lu, do you have a grudge against these barbarians?" Lu Chen's body paused for a moment. He did not turn back. After a while, he said, "I have a grudge against them. But it is not to the extent that I have to kill them. But if someone wants to kill me first, I will kill them first." Xian was speechless. Her expression was complicated. Everything that happened in front of her, including Lu Chen, was completely different from the simple life she had met in the past. It was far beyond her understanding. If the person who saved her yesterday was a strange and brave man, then today, Lu Chen seemed to have suddenly become a completely different person. "Let's go." Lu Chen, who was in front, turned around and called out to her. Xian was shocked. She quickly replied and quickly walked over. But just as she walked past the cave and was about to walk up the slope to leave with Lu Chen, suddenly, a few sorrowful cries came from the entrance of the cave. Then, a small body climbed out of the cave with some difficulty. It was a puppy with black fur and a white stripe on its back. One of its hind legs was unnaturally drooping on the ground. It seemed to be broken. Its body was also messy and dirty. It looked extremely miserable. The puppy struggled to climb out, as if it had used up the last bit of its strength. It desperately wanted to live. Then, it barked a few times at Xian, who was not far away. "Woof, woof, woof." Xian stopped in her tracks. Her face showed that she could not bear to see it. This kind of compassion made Xian feel a little strange. In the past, when she passed by some towns, she had seen such pitiful stray dogs and cats. But at this moment, her heart seemed to be especially soft. Maybe it was because from last night until today, she suddenly saw too much killing and blood that she had never seen in her life. That kind of heavy pressure almost made it hard for her to breathe. Or maybe she was simply soft-hearted. So, she turned around and walked towards the puppy. Lu Chen, who was in front, stopped and looked at her. He frowned. Xian walked to the side of the puppy and squatted down. She carefully looked at it and immediately found that the situation of the puppy was worse than she had imagined. In addition to the broken leg, there were at least a dozen large and small wounds and cracks on the puppy's body. It was not an exaggeration to say that it was covered with cuts and bruises. Some of the flesh near the wounds even looked a little rotten, exuding a disgusting stench. It was really hard to imagine what kind of torture this puppy had suffered in the hands of the ferocious barbarian in the past days. "Let's save it." Xian turned around and shouted at Lu Chen. Lu Chen shook his head expressionlessly. Xian clenched her teeth and slowly stood up. The puppy looked at her and softly barked a few times. Xian's expression changed. The life and death experiences from last night to today flashed in her mind. Those extremely bloody scenes suddenly stimulated her to the point of nausea. She didn't know where the courage came from, or maybe it was a sudden burst of resentment after being suppressed for too long, but Xian suddenly stomped her feet and took out a piece of cloth to wrap the little black dog. She then struggled to pick it up with one hand and walked away with her head lowered. When she walked past Lu Chen, she did not dare to look at his face, but her body still paused for a moment. Then with a soft and slightly trembling voice, she said, I want to save it." After saying that, she ran forward in big strides. Lu Chen's face showed a stunned expression. Looking at the girl's back, his face showed a rare look of confusion. "This woman, what is in her brain?" He muttered in a low voice, shook his head and followed. However, he had only taken 2 steps when he suddenly heard a cry in front of him. Lu Chen was startled and looked up. He saw that Xian was running too fast and didn't see the road clearly. Just as she entered the forest, she tripped on a shrub branch and fell on her back. The puppy was also thrown out and landed in the grass with a plop sound. Immediately, wails and cries of alarm rose and fell one after another. Lu Chen sighed helplessly and looked up at the sky. Then he walked over to help Xian up. Xian's face was red and she did not dare to look at him. She lowered her head and patted the dust off her body. Then she ran over to pick up the puppy, who knew that when she moved, Lu Chen pulled her to the side. Xian panicked and said, Don't stop me, I want to save. Shut up. Lu Chen stopped her in a bad mood and walked over to pick up the puppy. He glared at Xianxia and said, "Don't talk nonsense, let's go." Xianxia said embarrassedly, "Ooh." Lu Chen snorted and ignored her. He grabbed the puppy and walked forward. At the same time, he said, "I spent a lot of effort to fix your hand. Don't break it again for no reason. So troublesome." Xianxia's mouth opened. Looking at the man's back, the corner of her mouth suddenly curled up, revealing a happy smile. "Hey, why are you in a daze?" Lu Chen, who was in front, turned back and shouted. Xianxia jumped in fright. She quickly chased after him while saying, "Coming, coming." She ran behind Lu Chen like a wisp of smoke, closely following him as they walked out of the forest. Chapter 69. The two of them walked all the way out of the forest and returned to the river valley. Under the sunlight, the bloodthirsty demon flowers were still incomparably gorgeous, and the yellow leopard that had been dragged over not long ago had long disappeared, leaving only a blood stain on the ground. Lu Chen and Xianxia walked directly out of the river valley. No matter what, with such a large field of bloodthirsty demon flowers growing here, it was really not a pleasant place to be. After walking out of the river valley, Lu Chen found a flat and safe place by the river. He first put down the little dog in his hand, then called Xianxia over and examined her injured arm. In the end, he nodded and said, "It's good, the bones are not crooked." As he spoke, he looked as if he had been relieved of a heavy burden, but it was unknown whether he was worried about Xianxia or remembering the results of his previous treatment for her. After saying this, Lu Chen walked to the side, minding his own business. Xianxia glanced at him and wanted to say something, but then she immediately swallowed her words. She then walked with some difficulty to the little black dog and sat down next to it. The little black dog raised its head and glanced at her. Speaking of which, it was strange. Even though this little dog's entire body was covered in scars, it stank to the heavens, and its fur was dirty to the point it was knotted together, making it extremely unsightly. Only its eyes were still bright and clear. Perhaps that was the only beautiful thing on its body. Xianxia sighed and said in a low voice, "I'll help you. Don't bite me." The little black dog looked at her for a while, then barked, but it was unknown whether it agreed or not. Xianxia searched her bosom for a while, and after a while, took out a silk handkerchief. Then, with some difficulty, she used her remaining uninjured hand to use the silk handkerchief to wipe the dust off the little black dog's body, as well as the shocking wounds. Perhaps it felt the kindness of the young woman in front of it, but the little black dog did not avoid or struggle, and actually obediently lay on the ground, not moving at all. In the distance, Lu Chen glanced over, his expression still indifferent, and no change could be seen. However, Xianxia's movements looked a little clumsy, and it was obvious that she had never done such a thing before. In addition, the little black dog's injuries were too many and too heavy, so after a few tries, she accidentally touched the little black dog's wounds, immediately causing its body to tremble and let out a cry. Xianxia's hand suddenly trembled, and she hurriedly said in a soft voice, I'm sorry, I'll be gentle, woof 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 woof." Before her voice died away, the little black dog let out another cry. It turned out that Xianxia had just avoided a wound, and then pressed on another wound, causing the little black dog to tremble in pain. This happened a few times in a row. On the originally calm and peaceful riverside, only the dog's barking could be heard, mournful and painful with a bit of helplessness. The young woman's forehead was covered in sweat, and her only hand kept waving the silk handkerchief, and every movement was a little stiff. In the end, she did not even dare to press down again, and her pair of eyes flickered with tears, looking like she was about to cry. "Hey!" A familiar voice rang out behind her. Xianxia shivered and looked back, only to see that Lu Chen had walked behind her, and stood there with a helpless expression on his face. He used his hand to gently pat his forehead and said, "Get out of the way." Xianxia was stunned for a moment, and said, "What are you doing?" Lu Chen glared at her unhappily and said, "Although I didn't want to save this dog in the beginning, but I can't just watch you make it suffer to death here." Xianxia was speechless, and her face was red as if it was about to catch fire. She hurriedly took a step back, and at the same time, she muttered in a low voice. I didn't mean to." Lu Chen did not pay attention to her at all, and squatted down to look at the little black dog, and then looked at the injuries on its body, and finally touched the broken leg, and his eyebrows slowly wrinkled. Xian had been watching him carefully, and seeing his serious expression, her heart could not help but sink, and she hurriedly asked, "Brother Lu, how is it? Is the little dog okay?" Lu Chen did not answer her question, and only pondered for a moment, and then glanced at the little dog and said lightly, "If you want to live, be obedient." Facing Lu Chen, the little black dog was obviously much more nervous than before, and its whole body looked a little stiff, and then it softly whimpered a few times, and it was unknown whether it understood Lu Chen's words. Lu Chen turned his hand, and the black dagger appeared in his hand again, and then directly turned his hand over to cut the little black dog. Xianxia, who was standing to the side, cried out in alarm, and her body involuntarily took a step forward. The little black dog also suddenly barked, and it looked like it was scared out of its wits, and there was a look of despair in its eyes as it lay on the ground. But after a moment, suddenly, a piece of black fur was seen floating in the air, and then slowly falling down. It turned out that Lu Chen had swung his sword to scrape off a piece of fur on the little dog's body, and then they saw him move the sword as if it was flying, one slash after another, and actually began to shave the little dog's fur. In the midst of this, because of all kinds of tangled fur, and because it was riddled with wounds, it could not avoid touching the little black dog's wounds, and the little dog was in so much pain that it cried out, but the expression on Lu Chen's face did not change. And as if frightened by the sharp murderous aura of the black dagger, although the little dog cried out in pain, it still forced its body to lie on the ground, and did not dare to move at all. Not long after, fur was scattered on the ground, and the little dog from head to toe, all the fur on its body was shaved. The original little black dog had become a little bald dog, and its body was completely bare, and it was really ugly and comical. But it also made it more clear that the little dog's body was densely covered with wounds, and it was a ghastly sight. After finishing the shave, Lu Chen did not stop. First, he swept over all the little dog's wounds, ignoring the old wounds that had already formed scabs, and first sprinkled some medicinal powder on the new wounds, and then used cloth to bandage them. Then he went to the wounds that had already rotted, and after a pause, he stretched out his hand to press the little dog's body, and then glanced at the little dog and said calmly, "Bear with it." The bald little dog stared blankly at Lu Chen, and then looked at the black dagger in his hand, and its body violently convulsed and trembled. Under the horrified gaze of Xianxia, Lu Chen directly swung the dagger down, and the sword cut into the little dog's rotting wounds, and then with a twist of the blade, the rotten flesh was directly cut off, and he flung it to the side. The little dog let out an incomparably shrill cry, as if its heart and lungs were being torn apart, and its whole body trembled incessantly. But what was surprising was that although it looked like it was in extreme pain, it really was lying on the ground, not moving. This puppy was actually enduring the pain with great difficulty. Lu Chen also seemed to be a little surprised, and he tilted his head to look at it, a faint trace of admiration in his eyes. Chapter 70. Although he was surprised by the black puppy's endurance, Lu Chen's hands did not stop. The black sword danced around the puppy's body, and not long after, 3 pieces of rotten flesh were cut off from the puppy's body. Fresh blood flowed all over the ground. Then, Lu Chen skillfully took out some strange medicinal powder and sprinkled it on the puppy's wounds. The bleeding quickly stopped, and he used a white cloth to bandage the puppy's wounds. After that, the puppy looked like it was on the verge of death. It had no strength left, and could only rest its head on the ground, gasping for air. On the other hand, Xianxia, who was standing at the side, was horrified, and her face seemed to be slightly pale. However, after seeing that the wounds were bandaged with white cloth, Xianxia heaved a sigh of relief and said softly, "Thank you, Brother Lu." Lu Chen looked at her and said, "It's not over yet." Xianxia was shocked and said, "What else?" Lu Chen silently turned his head, as if he had nothing to say. He just pointed at the puppy's hind leg. There was a broken leg there. Xianxia was speechless and did not know what to say. Fortunately, Lu Chen did not say much. He walked to the side and chopped a wooden stick, just like how he treated Xianxia this morning. Taking advantage of this gap, Xianxia squatted beside the puppy and said softly, "Puppy, don't be afraid. Brother Lu is very powerful. He will heal all your wounds. This leg is different from your hand." Lu Chen's voice rang in her ear. Xianxia looked up and saw Lu Chen squatting down again with a wooden stick. He said calmly, "Although your hand is broken, it was reattached quickly and there is medicine. If there are no accidents, it will recover in 1 or 2 months. However, this puppy's leg is different. It has been broken for too long." What will happen to it?" Xianxia asked anxiously. Lu Chen thought for a while and said, "It can probably be reattached, but it definitely won't recover. The best case scenario is that it will become a lame dog." "Lame dog?" Xianxia muttered blankly. She didn't know what to say. On the other side, Lu Chen had already grabbed the broken dog's leg. First, he checked the wound, then he cleaned it carefully. He carefully aligned the bones and applied some medicinal powder. Finally, he used a strip of white cloth to tie the dog's leg tightly to the wooden stick. At this point, the plan to save the dog had finally come to an end. Looking at it now, not only was the original black puppy bald, its body was also covered with white strips of cloth, and a wooden stick was tied to its hind leg. It was as comical as one could imagine, but compared to the tragic scene in the barbarian's cave, it was much better. After such a torment, they were delayed for a long time. The two of them did not travel far that day. In the end, they only walked for a few miles from the river valley before the sky darkened. As usual, it was not allowed to light a fire in the night in the disordered land. Lu Chen and Xianxia did not stay in the open space near the riverbank. According to Lu Chen, when night came, it was very likely that some monsters would come to the riverbank to drink water. At that time, staying there would only lead to death. Xianxia naturally listened to Lu Chen. Thus, the two of them found a tall tree and climbed up, bringing along the dog. When the sky was completely dark, Xianxia leaned against the tree trunk and hugged the wrapped-up dog in her arms. She comforted it softly, looking like she was comforting a child. Her voice was slow and gentle, like the whispers of the forest, but also like a warm spring breeze. "Don't be afraid. We've already saved you, so of course we won't abandon you. At least we'll wait until you've recovered. When that time comes, I'll let you go. Even if you let it go, it will still die," Lu Chen, who was sitting on the other side of the tree, suddenly said. Xianxia was a little surprised. Lu Chen raised his head and looked at the gloomy and dark night sky. After a moment of silence, he said, "Didn't you ask me earlier why this kind of dog doesn't need to be saved? This dog is a mixed breed. Its bloodline comes from 2 kinds of monsters, the snow wolf and the black jackal. The snow wolf was a proud and powerful high-grade demon beast. It had always lived alone. When the male snow wolf is in heat, it will casually rape the weak black jackal because it can't find a mate. However, it will never care about its offspring. The black jackal, on the other hand, is naturally fierce and autistic. It especially values the purity of the dog's bloodline. Once a mixed breed like this appears in front of the black jackal, it will be attacked by all the black jackals and directly torn to pieces. This is also the reason why these mixed breeds almost never grow up. Almost all dogs are bitten to death as soon as they are born." Xianxia silently lowered her head. The puppy in her arms softly whimpered. No one knew if it was complaining about its tragic fate. Why this unlucky puppy was not bitten to death when it was born, and why it fell into the hands of the old barbarian to be tortured. These things were naturally untraceable now. However, the following days were considered peaceful. Lu Chen led Xianxia and the puppy forward in the disorienting lands. They did not encounter any major problems along the way. About 5 days later, they finally returned to the Leaping Tiger Gorge. Thinking about it, it was as if they had gone around in a circle and came back. However, there were 4 of them when they entered the disorienting lands, but only 2 were left. This inevitably made Xianxia feel a little sad. On the contrary, in these 5 days, the unlucky puppy seemed to have a cheap life. Its heavy injuries actually healed very quickly. After a few days, it was able to run around on the ground. However, just as Lu Chen had said before, this puppy's leg was forever lame. When it ran, it would limp, making it look very awkward and ugly. Strangely enough, after this puppy was able to move around freely, Lu Chen and Xian did not hold on to it. However, the puppy obediently followed them and never showed any signs of sneaking away. It just followed them all the way. As they entered the Leaping Tiger Gorge, Lu Chen glanced at the puppy. Seeing that it was very curious as it limped back and forth, looking at the surrounding scenery, Lu Chen could not be bothered with it. Instead, he said to Xian, "After this, we will be considered to have left the disorienting lands. Let's go our separate ways here." Xian's footsteps paused for a moment. After a moment of hesitation, she looked at Lu Chen with a sincere expression of gratitude. She said, "Brother Lu, I really thank you." Lu Chen smiled and said, "Don't mention it. It was nothing." Xian shook her head and sighed. "It's not like that. I know that I am a very stupid person and caused you a lot of trouble along the way. Brother Lu, I won't say anything else. If there is a chance in the future, come find me at Kunlun Mountain. I will definitely." "Huh?" Lu Chen was stunned. He stopped in his tracks and looked at Xian with a shocked expression. "What? You are a disciple of the Kunlun party?" Chapter 71. Xian blushed and said, "Well, I'm not really one yet, but I should be one after a while." Lu Chen became curious and asked a few more questions. As it turned out, although Xian looked delicate, she was actually a woman with an impressive background. She was born in Kunwu City, at the foot of the Kunlun Mountains. She was the daughter of a member of the Yi clan. The Yi clan had a close relationship with the Kunlun party for many years. Over the years, many of their disciples had entered the Kunlun party. When Xian was young, a powerful golden core cultivator had taken a fancy to this girl's potential. He had contacted the Yi family in advance and was prepared to take her in as a disciple. However, something unexpected happened to Jean Dan Friar and he was seriously injured. He was forced to go into seclusion for 10 years, which delayed Xian's acceptance as a disciple. However, this matter was known to the Kunlun party and the Yi clan did not conceal it. Therefore, almost everyone in the Kunlun Mountains regarded Xian as a disciple of the Kunlun sect. The two people who came with Xian this time were also official disciples of the Kunlun party. When they accepted the task of gathering the dusk fog flower, they brought Xian with them. Firstly, it was to show their closeness. Secondly, it was also to curry favor with Jean Dan Friar, who was rumored to be recovering from his injuries and coming out of seclusion. Once that powerful person came out of seclusion, it wouldn't be long before Xian officially entered the Kunlun party. "Congratulations, congratulations," Lu Chen said to Xian with a smile. Xian smiled and nodded. Looking at Lu Chen, she felt that this man's smile was gentle and his face was calm. He looked harmless, but he didn't have the cold, murderous aura that he occasionally displayed in the Land of Chaos. For a moment, Xian was even in a trance. She felt that when she looked at Lu Chen, she was hallucinating. One was a man standing in the light with a gentle smile, the other was a cold and murderous demon hiding in the dark. However, this kind of thinking was a bit ridiculous. Xian shook her head to get rid of this boring thought and said goodbye to Lu Chen. Then she waved at the dog standing next to her and said with a smile, "Atsu, come here, I'll take you home." Atsu was the name they gave to the dog. Originally, Lu Chen had given the dog even more random and unpleasant names, such as Hei Wang, Hua, Baldy. In his words, the dog would run away sooner or later anyway, so there was no need to bother giving it a good name. Finally, when Xian saw that the dog was pitiful, she mustered up the courage to speak up for justice and argued for this unlucky dog. After refuting these unpleasant names one by one, the two reluctantly came up with a homonym for Baldy and simply called it Atsu. Although it sounded rustic, it was at least down to earth and not particularly unpleasant. Although it still felt a little like calling a peasant dog, looking at Atsu's current appearance, not only was it bald, it was also wrapped in a lot of cloth strips. Coupled with that limping leg, it really didn't look good. It might not even be as good as a real peasant dog. So a peasant dog, so be it. That was probably what Xian thought helplessly at the time. However, ever since they left the river valley in the Land of Chaos, Xian had grown to like Atsu a little. Speaking of which, she grew up in the E family, so her living conditions were naturally excellent. However, due to her strict upbringing, she had never raised a cat or a dog. Now, she really liked Atsu, which had been rather obedient these few days. Lu Chen stood at the side and looked at Exen in surprise. You taking it home to raise? Yes, Exen said happily. Atsu is also very pitiful. Look at how badly it's injured. Lu Chen glanced at Atu, who was standing not too far away from his feet. When he first found him, he was indeed severely injured. However, this dog had the bloodline of a demonic beast, so his recovery ability was astonishing. In just a few days, the wounds on his body had healed a lot, especially the injury on his broken leg. Although he couldn't change the fact that he was lame, he could still run after throwing away the wooden stick. In comparison, the wooden stick in Xianxia's hand was still there. Lu Chen shrugged and said, "If you want to raise it, then raise it. Up to you." Atsu, come here. Exen waved at the puppy with a smile on her face. Atsu obediently wagged its tail and ran to her feet. Exen squatted down and touched Atsu's bald head with a doting look on her face. "Atsu, say goodbye to Brother Lu. We're going home." Atsu tilted its head and looked at Exen with a pair of unusually bright eyes. Then it barked twice. Exen laughed. She pointed at Lu Chen and said, "We're saying goodbye to Brother Lu. We're leaving soon." Atsu blinked its eyes. It looked at Exen, then looked back at Lu Chen. Then, it barked at Exen again. Then, it turned around and ran to Lu Chen's side, lying down. Lu Chen and Exen were stunned at the same time. It didn't look like it was going to say goodbye. After a while, Lu Chen suddenly frowned as if he thought of something. On the other side, Exen ran over and reached out to hug Atsu. At the same time she said, "Atsu, are you stupid? I mean..." Before she finished speaking, the puppy shrank back and avoided Exen's arm. Then, it hid behind Lu Chen. This time, the meaning of Atsu couldn't be clearer. Exen also stood up in shock. After a while, she suddenly felt a little embarrassed and said angrily, "Hey! Stinky Atsu, are you kidding me? These days, I'm the one who fed you, hugged you when you slept, and played with you normally. But now, you choose Brother Lu and not me?" Atsu's bald head poked out from behind Lu Chen's calf. It looked a little sneaky. Then, it barked twice, as if admitting to it. Lu Chen rolled his eyes. Atsu rubbed its head against his leg and wagged its tail like a windmill. It looked like it was trying to flatter him. Exen rubbed her forehead with her hand. Then she pointed at Atsu and said, Lu Chen coughed and said, "I can roughly guess the reason." "What is it?" Exen immediately asked. For millions of years, the chaotic lands has always been a dangerous world where the strong prey on the weak. The countless creatures here, including demonic beasts of all sizes, have long gotten used to this set of rules. So, when they are still small and weak, if they have a choice, all demonic beasts will follow their innate instincts and attach themselves to the stronger side. Lu Chen looked at Exen and smiled. He didn't finish his sentence. Exen stood rooted to the ground. Her pretty face was a little red. After a while, she said hatefully, "Damn it, even a little bastard like you is looking down on me." Chapter 72. Atsu looked at Exen with some affection in its eyes, but it still refused to come out from behind Lu Chen. It seemed that it was determined to follow Lu Chen. Lu Chen also sighed and said to Atsu, "Hey, stupid dog, let me tell you, if you follow her, you can live a good life without worrying about food and drink. That is a happy life. If you follow me, you won't have a good life. Maybe you will die in the wilderness at any time." That's right, Exen repeated, looking at Atsu eagerly. This time, Atsu didn't even look at Exen, it just looked at Lu Chen and wagged its tail desperately. You stupid dog." Exen was so angry that she couldn't speak, but she was also a little reluctant to leave Atsu. Her eyes were a little red. In the following period of time, 2 people and a dog spent almost half a cup of tea's time at the exit of the Leaping Tiger Gorge. However, no matter how much Exen tried to persuade him, Atsu was still indifferent. In the end, Exen finally gave up. She had no choice but to say goodbye to Lu Chen. Before she left, she sighed and said to Lu Chen, "Brother Lu, from now on Atsu is in your hands, you must. When I am hungry, I will kill it and stew it." Lu Chen said to Xian very calmly. Xian was stunned. After a while, she stammered, What did you say?" Lu Chen said matter-of-factly, "I didn't want to keep a dog. Even when I saved it that day, you insisted. I didn't ask it to follow me. If this dog insists, I can stew it and eat it. It doesn't seem to be a problem." "Something's wrong," Xian almost shouted. Then she put on a sad face and said, "Brother Lu, Atsu is so pitiful. Don't eat it, just let it go." Lu Chen looked at her appearance and couldn't help but laugh for a moment. There was an inexplicable warmth in his heart. Xian was still young and seemed to have been spoiled since childhood. She was indeed very pure. However, he didn't know why her family would allow such an inexperienced girl like her to come to such a dangerous place like the Land of Chaos. Lu Chen was startled. He frowned and looked at Xian from head to toe. Being stared at like this, Xian suddenly felt guilty. She took a step back and said, "Brother Lu, what's wrong?" Lu Chen snorted and said, "Don't tell me you snuck out without telling your family?" Xian was speechless. Her beautiful face flushed red. Looking at her, the answer was obvious. Lu Chen shook his head and said, "Forget it, it's none of my business. But we all know each other. You should be more careful in the future and don't run around." Xian lowered her head. Her eyes reddened as if she had thought of something. "I know. I will definitely apologize to my parents when I get back. And I even implicated Senior Uncle Han and Senior Brother He. If it wasn't for me—" "Hey!" Lu Chen suddenly interrupted her and frowned. "What nonsense are you talking about? What does their death have to do with you?" Xian bit her lip and said, "My cultivation is low. When the black jackals surrounded us, I couldn't help them, so, nonsense." Lu Chen snorted with disdain, and he looked at the young woman as if he was looking at an idiot. "Are you stupid? This has nothing to do with you. It was your first time coming to the chaotic lands. Han Nanzu and He Gang are proper disciples of Kunlun. They have cultivation and experience. Isn't it natural for them to take care of you? Wasn't it their fault that we ended up in that situation?" He sneered and said, "Not to mention the fact that I reminded them several times before I left that day. It's fine if you're young and insensible, but those two men were actually blinded by greed. They deserved to die. Instead, they dragged you down. Do you understand?" Xian was at a loss. After a while, she said with uncertainty, "Is that so?" Lu Chen said, "Of course it is so. Xian, I'm telling you, it's a good thing that you're kind-hearted, but if you can't tell right from wrong and blame yourself for everything you see, then you're not kind-hearted." Xian lowered her head and blushed. She glanced at him from the corner of her eye and asked guiltily, What is that?" Lu Chen said angrily, "That is called being stupid." Everything that needed to be said had finally been said. The dog that needed to go was stubbornly refusing to leave. Xian, who could not do anything about Atsu, finally waved goodbye to Lu Chen and the dog. Before they parted, she repeatedly exhorted Lu Chen and begged him for two things. First, he must not eat a. He is very obedient and honest, and he is fated to be with us. If he eats him, there might be retribution. Second, Big Brother Lu, if you have the chance in the future, you must come to Kunlun Mountain to find me, okay? It is too dangerous to be a guide in the Land of Chaos. Why don't I beg my parents and master to help you find a job as a Kunlun Party's odd job disciple? It is safe and comfortable, and you will be respected when you go out. Also, don't forget to bring Atsu to find me." I know. Even though Lu Chen was experienced, he could not stand the girl's long-winded pleading. He said, "I will not eat this dog. At most, I will ignore it. It is getting late. You should be on your way." Woof woof, woof 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 woof. Atsu lay at Lu Chen's feet and barked at Xian. Xian nodded. She was a little reluctant to part with Atsu. She had not seen much of the world. This time, she had stayed with Lu Chen and Atsu for so many days, so she had some feelings for them. She looked back with every step and waved her hand every 2 steps. She slowly left Lu Chen and walked forward. Lu Chen and Atsu looked at her together, And then gradually, the look in the eyes of the man and dog became a little strange. They must be a little reluctant to part with me, Xianxia thought. She felt a little warm but also a little shy. Her footsteps became slower. But at this moment, she suddenly heard Lu Chen's somewhat exasperated voice from behind her. Hey! What? Xianxia suddenly turned around and looked at Lu Chen. You are walking in the opposite direction. Xianxia suddenly froze on the spot as if she had been petrified. She looked around with difficulty and found that she had walked into the leaping tiger gorge again. A moment later, she suddenly let out a soft cry and covered her eyes with her hands. She didn't dare to look at Lu Chen and Atu again. She turned around and ran away with large strides, disappearing into the distance like a wisp of smoke. Vaguely, it seemed that Lu Chen's voice came from behind the dust. It seemed that he was talking to the dog beside him. Atsu, I can't believe there is someone more stupid than you. Woof 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 woof. Atsu barked again and again. It seemed to be very dissatisfied. You're tuning in to the Wandering Hero YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.